Imagine stepping quietly through the wooden entrance of a traditional Japanese geisha house several centuries ago from the outside. The building might appear modest, perhaps even ordinary, tucked among narrow streets where merchants, travelers, artisans, and townspeople moved through their daily routines. But inside, an entirely different world operated according to rules that were rarely written down and seldom explained to outsiders. Every movement had meaning, every greeting had its proper form, every garment, gesture, silence, and conversation could communicate something without a single direct word being spoken. A geisha house, more accurately known in many historical contexts as an okiya, was not simply a place where entertainers lived and worked. It was a highly organized household, built around training, reputation, hierarchy, hospitality, artistic performance, and carefully maintained relationships. To understand life inside one, you have to forget the modern image of the geisha as merely an elegant woman wearing a beautiful kimono and entertaining guests. Behind the cosmetics, music, dance, conversation, and elaborate hairstyles was a demanding social system in which reputation could determine the future of the entire household. The first unspoken rule was that the house itself came before the individual. An okiya functioned almost like a small family, business, school, and residence combined. The women living there were connected through a hierarchy that could include the house mother, senior geisha, apprentices, younger residents, and attendants. The head of the household, often called the okasan, controlled many important decisions. She could oversee finances, training, schedules, clothing, introductions, and relationships with patrons or establishments where entertainers performed. Her authority was not necessarily announced with dramatic commands. It was expressed through everyday expectations. A young apprentice learned very quickly that she was not simply learning how to perform a dance or play an instrument. She was learning how to exist correctly within a social structure. The second rule was that you watched before you spoke. A newcomer could not simply walk into the main room and behave as she pleased. She had to observe how senior women greeted visitors, how they sat, how they poured drinks, how they handled instruments, how they entered a room, and how they responded when someone of higher status arrived. Much of the education was based on imitation. The apprentice watched the older women closely, because many of the most important lessons were never delivered as formal instructions. If an experienced geisha lowered her voice when speaking to a particular guest, there was probably a reason. If she waited before taking her seat, there was probably a reason. If she used a particular expression instead of another, in a world where social rank and etiquette mattered enormously, understanding what was not said could be just as important as understanding what was said. The third rule concerned appearance. A geisha's appearance was not simply personal fashion. It was part of her professional identity, and, by extension, part of the reputation of the house. Clothing had to be maintained carefully. Kimonos were expensive and often associated with particular seasons, occasions, and levels of status. Hair, ornaments, footwear, makeup, and accessories all had conventions. An apprentice could not necessarily dress in exactly the same manner as an established geisha. Differences in hairstyle, ornaments, and clothing could indicate experience and rank. To modernize, these details might seem decorative, but within the culture of the entertainment districts, they could function almost like a visual language. Someone who understood the conventions could immediately recognize whether a woman was a beginner, an apprentice, or an established professional. The fourth rule was that beauty required discipline. The glamorous image of geisha life often hides how much preparation was involved. Dressing could take considerable time. Hair arrangements were elaborate. Clothing had to be wrapped and secured correctly. Movement had to be practiced so that the garment did not become an obstacle. Sitting, standing, walking, turning, pouring, bowing, and handling objects all required controlled movements. A geisha was expected to make difficult things look effortless. That meant the effort itself had to disappear. Guests were not supposed to see the exhaustion behind the performance. They were supposed to see calmness. This was one of the great contradictions of the profession. The more difficult the training became, the more natural the final performance was expected to appear. Another unspoken rule was that conversation was an art, not simply a way to exchange information. A skilled geisha was expected to understand the atmosphere of a gathering. Was the guest celebrating? Was the room becoming tense? Was someone uncomfortable? Was an important person being ignored? Was a joke appropriate? Should the conversation become serious or remain playful? The answer could change from moment to moment. The purpose was not necessarily to dominate a conversation, but to help create a pleasant atmosphere. This required memory, observation, timing, humor, cultural knowledge, and an understanding of people. Silence could also be useful. Speaking constantly could be just as awkward as refusing to speak. A pause at the right moment could give another person an opportunity to talk. A small question could encourage a guest to continue a story. A carefully chosen compliment could make someone feel respected without appearing excessive. In this environment, social intelligence was one of the most valuable skills a performer could possess. There was also an important rule about never embarrassing the house. Reputation was fragile. An entertainment district depended heavily on trust. Clients needed to believe that gatherings would be conducted appropriately, that performers would behave professionally, and that private matters would not become public gossip. A careless incident could damage not only one person's reputation, but the reputation of the household connected to her. For that reason, discretion was essential. What happened during a private gathering was not something to casually discuss afterward with neighbors. Personal opinions about guests were not necessarily meant to be repeated. Private conversations were private. Information about wealthy or influential visitors could be sensitive. In a society where networks and reputation mattered deeply, knowing when to remain silent could be a form of professional power. Another rule concerned punctuality. A geisha's schedule could be complicated, especially in prosperous entertainment districts where evenings involve several appointments, performances, or gatherings. Being late was not simply an inconvenience. It could be interpreted as disrespect. Preparations therefore had to begin long before the guest ever saw the performer. Clothing, makeup, instruments, transportation, and scheduling all had to be coordinated. A household had to function almost like a carefully managed organization. Behind a seemingly effortless evening was often a chain of preparation involving several people. The apprentice might assist an older woman, an attendant might prepare clothing or equipment, someone might arrange transportation, someone else might ensure that instruments were ready. The guest saw the final performance, but rarely saw the machinery behind it. One of the most important unspoken rules was respect for hierarchy. The younger women did not automatically possess the same freedom as senior professionals. Apprentices were still learning, and their behavior reflected on those teaching them. A younger woman might be expected to assist an older sister figure, observe her closely, and follow established customs. This relationship could be demanding, but it could also become an important source of education. The senior woman demonstrated how to handle guests, how to wear clothing correctly, how to perform artistic skills, and how to navigate the complicated social world surrounding the profession. The apprentice learned not only technical skills, but also the subtle habits that separated an inexperienced performer from someone who had mastered the culture of the profession. Training was therefore much broader than dance lessons. Music was important. Traditional instruments such as the shamisen required extensive practice. Singing required control and memory. Dance required posture, balance, rhythm, and precision. But artistic ability alone was not enough. A geisha also needed knowledge of seasonal customs, poetry, literature, traditional games, conversation, and etiquette. She needed to understand what kind of entertainment suited a particular gathering. A formal event might require a very different atmosphere from a casual evening with familiar guests. Knowing the difference was part of professional competence. Another rule involved the importance of seasons. Traditional Japanese culture placed enormous emphasis on seasonal awareness, and this was reflected in clothing, decorations, food, poetry, flowers, music, and conversation. A skilled entertainer could demonstrate cultural knowledge through something as small as noticing an appropriate seasonal reference. The details mattered because they showed that the performer understood the world in which the guest was participating. The room itself could change with the calendar. Decorations might reflect spring blossoms, summer insects, autumn foliage, or winter imagery. Clothing patterns could change, certain foods and drinks might become more appropriate. Even the tone of conversation could shift. To an outsider, these details might appear insignificant. But the deeper you look into the daily life of such a household, the more you discover that the rules extended far beyond the moments when a geisha was entertaining guests. Much of life inside the house was governed by routines that could seem almost invisible to an outsider. Morning did not necessarily begin with leisurely relaxation. There were garments to care for, rooms to maintain, lessons to attend, instruments to practice, errands to complete, and schedules to prepare. The glamorous evening was only one part of the day. A young apprentice might spend hours learning a movement that lasted only a few seconds during an evening performance. She might repeat the same musical passage until her fingers could perform it without conscious thought. She might practice the correct way to kneel, turn, bow, hold a fan, or move across a tatami floor. The goal was not simply to know the action, but to make the action appear completely natural. This was especially important because traditional Japanese arts often valued precision that could be difficult for outsiders to notice. A dance could contain small movements of the hands, eyes, shoulders, or fan that carried significance. A shamisen performance depended not only on playing the correct notes but also on rhythm, timing, posture, and expression. A song required more than remembering words. It required understanding how the voice should interact with the mood of the gathering. The performer had to know when to hold a note, when to pause, and how to allow the music to create an atmosphere rather than simply fill the room with sound. These details were part of the invisible education of the house. Another rule was that learning never really ended. Even a successful geisha could not simply decide that she had mastered everything. Artistic traditions were broad, and expectations changed with seasons, venues, guests, and circumstances. A performer might continue studying music, dance, singing, tea, related etiquette, poetry, conversation, and regional customs for years. The distinction between apprentice and experienced professional therefore involved more than age. Experience meant knowing how to handle situations that could never be fully taught from a textbook. It meant recognizing the mood of a room almost immediately. It meant understanding that one guest might appreciate humor while another preferred quiet conversation. It meant knowing how to recover when a performance did not go exactly as planned. There was also a rule about personal space and boundaries. A geisha's professional warmth could easily be misunderstood by modern observers who see historical entertainment through today's assumptions. But hospitality and personal intimacy were not automatically the same thing. A skilled performer could be charming, attentive, humorous, and engaging while still maintaining professional boundaries. The ability to create that balance was part of the craft. A guest might leave feeling that the performer had given him her complete attention, even though she had been carefully managing the interaction throughout the evening. This was not necessarily deception. It was professional performance, much like an accomplished actor, making an audience believe in a character. The distinction between the private person and the professional persona could therefore become important when the geisha entered a gathering. She was representing more than herself. She represented her training, her senior colleagues, and the house connected to her. Her appearance, speech, and behavior could influence how others perceived the entire establishment. This created enormous pressure to avoid careless behavior. A harsh remark, an inappropriate joke, an argument, or a public display of anger could be remembered long after an ordinary mistake had been forgotten. Reputation traveled quickly in close social networks. Entertainment districts were communities in which establishments, performers, musicians, merchants, restaurant owners, and customers interacted repeatedly. People knew one another. News could travel through conversations long before modern communications existed. A person who repeatedly behaved badly could become known for it. A performer who was dependable and gracious could build the opposite reputation. This meant that consistency mattered. Being charming once was not enough. The real achievement was being reliable over years. This explains another unspoken rule: never underestimate the importance of small details. A cup of tea, a carefully chosen phrase, the arrangement of a flower, the timing of a song, or the way a door was closed might appear insignificant individually. Together, they created the atmosphere of refinement that guests expected. Hospitality was constructed from details. The guest did not need to understand every decision. In fact, the less the guest noticed the effort, the more successful the performance could feel. The house also had its own rhythms. Certain times of year could become particularly busy because of festivals, celebrations, performances, or seasonal events. During these periods, preparation could intensify. Clothing had to be selected and maintained. Hair arrangements had to be organized. Performances had to be rehearsed. Invitations and appointments needed attention. Senior women might have more responsibilities, while apprentices could find themselves working long hours. The household had to coordinate many moving parts without allowing the pressure to become visible to visitors. Seasonal change also affected the emotional atmosphere of the house. Traditional Japanese aesthetics often emphasized the temporary nature of beauty. Cherry blossoms were beautiful precisely because they did not last. Autumn leaves signaled change. Winter suggested stillness. Summer brought a different visual and sensory world. These ideas could appear in songs, decorations, clothing, poetry, and conversation. A performer who understood seasonal aesthetics could make an evening feel connected to a much larger cultural tradition. Even food could become part of this language. A gathering might include dishes chosen according to season, occasion, or status. The presentation mattered. The order in which things appeared could matter. A guest might not consciously analyze these details, but the overall experience could communicate care and refinement. Hospitality therefore involved more than serving food. It involved creating a coherent experience in which visual, musical, conversational, and culinary elements supported one another. Another quiet rule was knowing how to behave around wealth and status. Some guests might have been influential merchants, officials, artists, or members of powerful families. Yet excessive flattery could be just as awkward as insufficient respect. The performer had to navigate the space between deference and natural conversation. This required social intelligence she needed to make important guests feel respected without appearing frightened or servile. At the same time, she had to recognize when a less prominent guest deserved attention. Ignoring someone simply because another person seemed more important could damage the atmosphere. This is why the ability to read a room was so valuable. Imagine a gathering in which several people are speaking at once. One person is telling a story. Another has become unusually quiet. Someone else is waiting for a drink. The performer has to notice all of this while maintaining her own composure. She may redirect the conversation, acknowledge the quiet person, assist with the drink, or introduce a game at exactly the right moment. None of these actions needs to look dramatic. The best intervention may be the one nobody notices. Silence was therefore not a failure. In many modern settings, people feel pressure to keep conversations moving constantly. Inside a highly refined traditional gathering, silence could have its own place. A moment of quiet could allow music to resonate. It could give a guest time to think. It could create anticipation before a performance. The performer needed to understand that an empty moment was not necessarily an uncomfortable moment. Sometimes the skill was knowing when not to fill it. Another rule concerned laughter. Laughter could make a gathering warmer, but uncontrolled laughter could become inappropriate, depending on the setting. The same applied to teasing. Humor required judgment. A joke that was amusing among close friends might be inappropriate in a formal gathering. The performer needed to understand relationships, personalities, and social boundaries. This was another reason why experience mattered so much. Younger apprentices could know the formal rules but still lack the instinct to recognize subtle differences in atmosphere. The house also taught patience. A young woman entering training could not expect to become a celebrated performer immediately. There was a long period of learning in which she might spend much of her time observing and assisting others. To modern eyes, this could seem frustrating, but the logic was that a person could not perform an art convincingly without first understanding its foundations. Patience was part of the training itself. There could also be an emotional complexity to living within such a hierarchy. Senior women could become mentors, but they could also be strict. Younger apprentices depended on older members for instruction and guidance. Yet they were expected to respect the hierarchy. Friendships could develop, but so could competition. A successful senior geisha might become a role model for a younger apprentice, while simultaneously representing the standard she was expected to reach. The concept of an older-sister relationship could be particularly important in training. There was another dimension to life inside the house that outsiders rarely saw: the constant awareness of time. A geisha did not simply wake up and decide what she wanted to do that day. Her schedule could be shaped by lessons, rehearsals, appointments, performances, preparations, and obligations to the household. The evening that guests experienced as a relaxed few hours could require an entire day of preparation. This created a peculiar relationship with time. Leisure was not always truly leisure. Even moments that appeared quiet could contain preparation for something that would happen later. A young apprentice might spend the morning practicing dance, the afternoon studying music, and the evening accompanying a senior performer. Between these activities, she might help with household responsibilities or prepare her clothing. The repetition could be tiring, but it also created familiarity. Eventually, actions that had once required concentration became instinctive. The body learned what the mind no longer needed to consciously command. This was particularly important when performing in front of guests. Imagine trying to remember a song, control a shamisen, maintain elegant posture, monitor the reactions of several people, and remain aware of your clothing at the same time. For an inexperienced performer, each task could demand attention. For an accomplished one, these things had to happen almost simultaneously. That level of control could only come through repetition. The house therefore functioned as a place where mistakes were turned into lessons. An apprentice might make a small error in posture or etiquette and receive correction from someone more experienced. The correction could be immediate or subtle. Sometimes, a single glance from a senior woman could be enough. In a highly observant environment, not every lesson required a long explanation. The apprentice was expected to understand. This created another unspoken rule: pay attention when nobody is teaching you directly. A person who waited for explicit instructions would learn slowly. A person who watched everything could learn much faster. How did a senior performer greet a particular guest? How did she hold a cup? How long did she maintain eye contact? How did she respond when someone made an awkward joke? How did she leave the room? What did she do after returning from a performance? These small observations could contain more practical information than a formal lecture. There was also a hierarchy of knowledge. Not everything was necessarily revealed to a beginner at once. Some things could only be understood after experience. An apprentice might learn how to perform a particular dance long before understanding why that dance was appropriate for one occasion but not another. She might learn a polite phrase before understanding the subtle social situation in which it should be used. Knowledge, therefore, accumulated in layers. This made seniority meaningful. An experienced geisha possessed a kind of practical knowledge that could not easily be transferred through written instructions. She had encountered different personalities, unexpected situations, difficult guests, successful performances, embarrassing mistakes, and changing circumstances. Over time, she developed judgment. That judgment was perhaps more valuable than any individual artistic technique. One of the most important forms of judgment concerned guests. Not every guest wanted the same experience. Some wanted conversation, others wanted music. Some enjoyed traditional games, others preferred to listen quietly. A skilled performer could identify these differences quickly. A guest who spoke constantly might need someone who knew how to listen. A quiet guest might need gentle encouragement. Someone celebrating might welcome playful conversation. Someone exhausted after a long day might prefer a calmer atmosphere. The performer had to adapt without making the adaptation obvious. This ability to adapt was one of the hidden foundations of hospitality. It was not about pretending every guest was identical. It was about recognizing differences and responding appropriately. There was also an unspoken rule about never making the guest feel as though they were being studied. Observation was essential, but it had to remain invisible. A performer could notice a guest's mood without making a dramatic announcement about it. She could redirect a conversation without explaining why. She could provide something someone needed before they asked for it. The most impressive service often appeared almost magical because the preparation remained hidden. The same principle applied to conflict. Suppose two guests disagreed during an evening. Directly confronting the disagreement might make the situation worse. A skilled entertainer could introduce a new topic, invite another person into the conversation, suggest a game, or begin a musical performance. The goal was not necessarily to solve the disagreement, but to prevent it from controlling the atmosphere. This required extraordinary emotional awareness. The performer had to remain calm while everyone else reacted naturally. She could not allow another person's mood to become her own mood. If a guest became irritated, she could not immediately become irritated herself. If someone became overly excited, she still needed to remain composed. This emotional discipline could be exhausting. The public image of elegance often hides the amount of concentration required to maintain it. A person might be physically tired but still expected to appear attentive. She might have personal worries but still be expected to make conversation. She might have had a difficult day but still need to perform music with precision. The ability to separate personal circumstances from professional responsibilities was therefore another important part of the culture. But this should not be confused with the idea that geisha were emotionless. They were human beings living within a demanding social environment. They experienced friendship, affection, disappointment, ambition, loneliness, pride, exhaustion, humor, and frustration, just like anyone else. The difference was that the profession required careful control over how those emotions appeared in public. This distinction between private and public identity is one of the most fascinating aspects of the historical world. A woman could return home after an evening and remove the clothing, makeup, and ornaments associated with her professional role. The transformation could be almost symbolic. The person who had spent hours creating an atmosphere for others could finally become simply herself again. Yet the household did not stop. Clothing still needed care. Instruments still needed attention. Plans for the next day still existed. Senior women still had responsibilities. Apprentices still had lessons. The house was a living organization rather than a stage that disappeared, and the rule concerned cleanliness and order. In a traditional Japanese interior, disorder was difficult to hide. Tatami, wooden surfaces, paper screens, textiles, and carefully arranged objects created an environment where small imperfections could be noticeable. The appearance of the house therefore required constant attention. A guest entering a room should see calmness rather than preparation. That meant someone had already prepared the room. The placement of cushions, the arrangement of objects, the condition of the instruments, the appearance of the alcove, and the overall atmosphere all contributed to the impression. Nothing needed to look excessively decorated. In fact, restraint could be part of elegance. The idea was not to overwhelm the guest with possessions, but to create harmony. This sense of restraint extended to personal behavior. Being too loud could be inappropriate. Moving too quickly could look careless. Speaking excessively could make conversation difficult. Showing off could undermine refinement. Even compliments had to be balanced. Excessive praise could sound insincere, while insufficient acknowledgement could appear cold. The professional therefore operated within a narrow space between extremes. Too distant, and the guest felt ignored. Too familiar, and the boundaries of professionalism could become unclear. Too serious, and the evening became stiff. Too playful, and the atmosphere could lose its refinement. Too quiet and conversation could collapse. Too talkative, and the performer could dominate the gathering. Finding the middle ground was the real skill. This is why experienced performers could seem almost effortlessly confident. They had learned how to occupy that middle ground without constantly calculating every movement. Their experience allowed them to react naturally. There was also a rule about humility. A skilled performer could possess extraordinary abilities without constantly displaying them. She did not need to announce how many years she had trained. She did not need to tell guests how difficult a particular dance was. The performance itself demonstrated the skill. This is one reason traditional arts often emphasize repetition and refinement rather than dramatic self-promotion. The goal was to become so familiar with the technique that the technique disappeared beneath the expression. The audience saw the result. They did not see the hundreds of hours behind it. That principle applied to music, especially. A shamisen performance could sound simple to an inexperienced listener. But simplicity in traditional art can be deceptive. Timing, rhythm, tone, finger placement, posture, and emotional expression all contribute to the final result. A performer had to develop control before she could make the performance feel relaxed. The same was true of dance. A small movement of a fan could require considerable precision. Yet even after mastering the visible rules of appearance, conversation, music, and etiquette, a woman inside the house still had to learn one of the most difficult skills of all: understanding what could not be said directly. In a highly structured social environment, people did not always express disagreement openly. A pause could communicate hesitation. A change in tone could signal discomfort. A carefully chosen phrase could soften a refusal. A glance from a senior woman could tell an apprentice that she had misunderstood a situation. Learning this invisible language could take years because it depended upon context rather than simple vocabulary. An outsider might hear two people speaking politely and assume everything was perfectly harmonious. Someone experienced within the culture might recognize that the conversation was becoming strained. The difference was not necessarily in the words themselves, but in timing, expression, posture, and what was deliberately left unsaid. A geisha who could recognize these signals had an enormous professional advantage. She could respond before a minor problem became an obvious one. This was especially important during gatherings involving several guests. Every person brought a different personality into the room. One might be confident and talkative, another reserved, another eager to impress, and another simply there to enjoy the evening. The performer had to create balance among them. If one person dominated the conversation, others might disappear into silence. If the room became too quiet, the atmosphere could feel uncomfortable. The performer could subtly shift attention without making anyone feel corrected. This was almost like conducting an orchestra, except the instruments were people. A question here, a joke there, a song at the right moment, a pause when the conversation needed space. A game when the energy began to fall. The evening could appear spontaneous, but an experienced performer was constantly shaping its rhythm. Another unspoken rule was that you should never confuse attention with intrusion. A guest might appreciate being remembered, but that did not mean every private detail should be mentioned. Knowing something about someone was useful only when it improved the interaction. Revealing too much knowledge could make a person uncomfortable. The performer therefore needed discretion, not only about what she said, but also about what she chose not to say. This was particularly important in a world where people often returned to the same establishments. Relationships developed over months and years. A guest was not necessarily a stranger who appeared once and disappeared forever. Familiarity could grow, stories could be remembered, preferences could become known. But familiarity had to be handled carefully. The performer had to know the difference between a relationship that had become warm and one that was becoming too informal. That boundary could be difficult to define. A guest might joke with a performer because they had met many times. The performer could respond playfully while still maintaining professional awareness. The warmth was real, but it existed within a social role. This distinction between friendliness and familiarity was one of the most subtle aspects of the profession. Another rule involved the management of expectations. Once a performer developed a reputation for a particular style, guests might expect her to behave consistently. Someone known for musical talent might be requested for musical performances. Someone famous for conversation might attract guests who wanted a lively evening. Someone associated with a particular artistic style could become recognized for it. Reputation therefore created opportunity, but also pressure. The better known a person became, the more carefully she had to maintain her status. If someone had been praised for years as an exceptional performer, an ordinary evening might be judged more harshly than it would be for a beginner. Success raised expectations. This meant that recognition was not simply a reward, it was also a responsibility. The same applied to the house itself. A respected okiya had something valuable to protect. Its reputation could attract guests and opportunities, but a serious mistake could damage years of work. The household, therefore, had a collective interest in maintaining standards. This explains why senior women could be strict about seemingly minor matters. A careless bow might appear insignificant. A poorly maintained garment might appear insignificant. An inappropriate joke might appear insignificant. Arriving late might appear insignificant. But repeated small failures created a pattern, and patterns became reputations. Reputation, once established, was difficult to change. The house also had to teach young women how to handle criticism. Not every correction would feel comfortable. A senior performer might point out a mistake bluntly, An apprentice might feel embarrassed or frustrated, but the expectation was that she would learn from the correction rather than argue over every detail. This could be difficult because artistic training is deeply personal. When someone criticizes your posture, your voice, your music, or your manner, it can feel as though they are criticizing you as a person. The mature performer learned to separate the two. A correction was not necessarily an insult. The question was whether you could use it. This attitude toward correction was essential, because improvement depended upon noticing mistakes that the learner could not see herself. A mirror could show posture. A teacher could see timing. A senior performer could recognize awkwardness that the apprentice did not yet understand. The apprenticeship system therefore relied heavily on observation from people who had already mastered the profession. And sometimes the most valuable correction was incredibly small. Move your hand slightly, slow down. Pause here, do not speak yet. Look toward the guest. Lower your voice. Wait. These tiny adjustments could transform the entire impression of a performance. Another important rule was to understand the significance of entrances and exits. Entering a room was not simply a matter of opening a door and walking inside. The moment of arrival established the atmosphere. A rushed entrance could feel careless. A controlled entrance communicated preparation. The same was true when leaving. Leaving too abruptly could interrupt a conversation. Remaining too long could become awkward. The timing had to fit the situation. This might sound trivial to a modern audience, but in formal hospitality, transitions matter. People remember beginnings and endings. A graceful beginning establishes expectations. A graceful ending leaves a positive memory. Therefore, even the final moments of an evening were part of the performance. The guest might remember the last exchange particularly clearly. A thoughtful farewell could make the entire evening feel more complete. The house therefore treated departure as another opportunity to demonstrate professionalism. After the guest left, however, the atmosphere could change instantly. The performer might finally relax her posture. The room could become quiet. The instruments could be put away. The clothing could be carefully handled. The household could begin preparing for tomorrow. This contrast between public and private life is important because it reminds us that historical performers were not permanently trapped inside the emotional atmosphere they created for guests. They had ordinary needs. They became tired. They laughed with friends. They worried about money. They thought about family. They could become frustrated. They could become ambitious. They could dream about the future. The public image was only one part of their identity. Another rule concerned food and daily routines. Historical entertainment districts are often imagined as places where every moment was glamorous, but much of daily life would have been ordinary. Meals had to be prepared. Clothing had to be cleaned and stored. Rooms needed maintenance. Personal belongings needed organization. Apprentices needed to practice. People needed sleep. The glamour was concentrated around specific moments. The rest of life continued like life everywhere else. This contrast makes the profession more believable. The house was not a permanent festival. It was a workplace. And workplaces have routines. Some days were exciting, some were exhausting, some were repetitive, some were memorable. The repetition itself was important because mastery rarely comes from occasional effort. It comes from doing something correctly again and again until the body stops resisting it. A dance performed once can be learned. A dance performed hundreds of times can become instinct. A song practiced once can be remembered. A song practiced for years can become part of a person's musical identity. A polite phrase memorized can sound artificial. A phrase used naturally for years can become effortless. The difference is experience. This was one of the greatest hidden advantages of seniority. An experienced geisha did not necessarily need to consciously think about every rule, because she had absorbed them. A beginner had to think a professional reacted. That distinction could be seen in the smallest details. The beginner might hesitate before sitting. The experienced performer already knew where to position herself. The beginner might search for the right phrase. The beginner might focus entirely on her own performance. The experienced performer could monitor the entire room. The beginner might become nervous when something unexpected happened. There was one final layer to the world inside the house that could easily be missed if you focused only on the formal rules, the importance of knowing how to disappear. In ordinary life, people often try to make themselves noticed. They speak louder, dress more boldly, tell stories about themselves, and seek attention. Inside a highly refined entertainment environment, however, a performer needed to know when to become the center of the room and when to quietly move into the background. Her success depended partly on understanding that she was not always the most important person present. If a guest was telling an important story, interrupting to demonstrate her own knowledge could weaken the atmosphere. If another performer was displaying an artistic skill, competing for attention could appear immature. If a senior woman was speaking, a younger apprentice needed to understand that the appropriate response might simply be to listen. The ability to step back without feeling invisible was itself a sign of confidence. This was particularly difficult for young people. Youth naturally brings an apprentice might want to prove that she had learned quickly. She might want guests to notice her music or compliment her appearance. She might feel proud after mastering a difficult dance. But the household taught her that professional confidence was different from self-display. The goal was not to prove that she was talented. The goal was to use her talent appropriately. That distinction could determine whether a performer appeared refined or inexperienced. An inexperienced performer might rush to fill silence. An experienced performer could allow silence to remain. An inexperienced performer might answer every question immediately. An experienced performer might pause and choose the right response. An inexperienced performer might An experienced performer might make the guest feel impressive. The difference was subtle, but it was enormous. This is why listening was treated as a skill rather than merely the absence of speaking. Good listening required concentration. The performer needed to remember details, notice emotions, recognize changes in tone, and understand what the guest actually wanted from the interaction. A person could speak for 10 minutes without saying what they truly needed. Sometimes a small question was enough to reveal it. The performer did not necessarily need to solve the guest's problems. She simply needed to understand the social situation. That ability was especially valuable when guests arrived carrying the frustrations of ordinary life. Business difficulties, family disagreements, financial worries, political concerns, or personal disappointments could follow a person into the entertainment district. The gathering could provide temporary relief. Conversation, music, food, and humor could give the guest a chance to step away from those concerns. The geisha's role was not to become a therapist or counselor in the modern sense, but she could create a space where someone felt listened to. That itself could be powerful. Sometimes people do not want advice. They want an evening in which they can breathe. The best hospitality understands that difference. This created another unspoken rule. Do not make everything about yourself. A performer could have her own stories, opinions, ambitions, and emotions, but the professional setting required her to understand the purpose of the gathering. The guest had come to participate in an experience, not necessarily to hear the performer's entire personal history. This did not mean the performer had to become empty or personality less. In fact, personality could be one of her greatest strengths. but personality had to be offered carefully. A little humour, a little wit, a little knowledge, a little charm, enough to create connection without taking over the room. The balance could be incredibly difficult. Another rule involved remembering that not every guest should be treated identically. Equality in modern social thinking does not always translate directly into historical etiquette. Status, age, professional relationships, familiarity, and occasion could influence how people were addressed. A person new to the environment might not understand these distinctions. A professional had to. The difference could appear in something as small as seating order or the sequence in which people were acknowledged. To an outsider, two seats might look identical. To someone familiar with the etiquette, one position could communicate greater respect. The same applied to introductions. Who introduced whom? Who spoke first? Who received attention? Who was served first? These details formed an invisible structure. A guest might never consciously notice it. But if everything happened correctly, the evening felt orderly. If something went wrong, the discomfort could become obvious. This is one reason traditional etiquette can seem almost mysterious to modern observers. Much of it operates below the level of conscious attention. People notice when something feels wrong before they can explain why. A professional learned to prevent that feeling. The environment had to feel natural. The guest should not constantly wonder whether he was behaving correctly. If he made a mistake, the performer could guide him gently. If he followed the customs, she could reinforce them without making a spectacle of it. The result was an atmosphere in which formal etiquette became almost invisible. Another important skill was knowing how to handle compliments. A guest might praise a woman's appearance, musical ability, clothing, or conversation. A beginner could become visibly excited or respond too strongly. An experienced performer understood how to accept praise without appearing arrogant. She might respond with modesty. She might redirect the compliment toward the teacher who trained her. She might make a light joke. She might simply thank the guest. The exact response depended upon context. The goal was to acknowledge the compliment without allowing it to become self-congratulation. This reflected a broader cultural ideal of controlled self-presentation. The performer could be proud privately. Publicly, she demonstrated humility. The same principle applied to success. If a performance received enthusiastic applause, she was expected to accept it gracefully. She did not need to announce that she knew she had performed well. If a guest requested her again, she could appreciate the recognition without treating it as proof that she was superior to others. The social world depended upon balance. Pride could motivate excellence. Excessive pride could damage relationships. Another unspoken rule was to remember that every evening could teach you something. Even a successful gathering could contain mistakes. Perhaps a conversation lasted too long. Perhaps a joke failed. Perhaps a guest became bored. Perhaps a song was performed at the wrong moment. Perhaps a younger apprentice hesitated. The experienced performer would reflect afterward. What worked? What did not? What could be improved? This kind of reflection helped transform experience into expertise. The house itself could become a continuous classroom. Every guest was different. Every situation provided new information. Every mistake could become a future advantage if properly understood. This was one reason older performers could possess a kind of social intuition that younger women could not easily imitate. They had simply seen more. They had watched more people. They had experienced more moods. They had recovered from more mistakes. They had learned which situations required directness and which required subtlety. Experience had given them a library of human behavior, and that library was constantly expanding. There was another form of intelligence that mattered, knowing when someone wanted to be alone. This might sound strange in a profession based on entertainment, but attention could become uncomfortable if it was excessive. A guest might be physically present but emotionally withdrawn. He might be tired, he might be thinking, he might not want conversation. A performer who constantly tried to draw him out could make the evening worse. A better approach might be quiet music, simple conversation, or a respectful pause. Knowing when not to perform was part of performing well. That principle extended to humour. A joke is only funny when the audience is ready for it. The same joke told at the wrong moment can feel cruel, embarrassing, or simply awkward. A professional needed to judge timing. This was especially important when humour involved another person. Teasing could strengthen relationships among familiar guests, but it could also humiliate someone if the performer misunderstood the relationship. The safest humour was often humour that created shared amusement without making one person the target again. The goal was harmony. The performer was not simply trying to make people laugh. She was trying to make the room feel comfortable. This explains why social intelligence could be as valuable as artistic talent. A technically brilliant musician who could not read a room might struggle. A less technically gifted performer who understood people exceptionally well could become deeply appreciated. Ideally, of course, the performer developed both. She could play beautifully and understand when to play. She could dance skillfully and understand when the dance would suit the atmosphere. She could speak intelligently and know when silence was better. This combination of technical skill and judgment was the real standard. Another hidden rule concerned preparation for unexpected guests. In a connected social network, plans could change. Someone unknown might arrive earlier than expected. Perhaps the strangest thing about the house was that its rules became most visible when nobody was talking about them. A newcomer could enter a room and immediately sense that there was an order to everything, even if she could not yet explain what that order was. Someone always seemed to know where to sit. Someone knew when to speak. Someone knew when to wait. Someone knew which object belonged where. Someone understood. The house functioned because its members shared an understanding that went deeper than a list of instructions. This understanding was learned gradually. An apprentice could memorize a formal rule in an afternoon, but knowing how to apply it in a real room could take years. The difference was context. Rules rarely existed in isolation. They interacted with one another. The correct behavior depended upon who was present, why they had gathered, what season it was, what time of day it was, and what kind of relationship already existed between the people in the room. This meant that the same action could communicate different things in different circumstances. A joke could be charming among familiar guests and inappropriate at a formal gathering. A long conversation could be welcomed one evening and become tiring another. A particular garment could be beautiful but unsuitable for a different occasion. A performer could be lively in one setting and deliberately restrained in another. The professional had to understand the difference. This was why observation remained one of the most important forms of education. An apprentice who watched carefully could learn patterns that were never formally explained. She might notice that a senior performer always changed her tone when speaking to a certain guest. She might notice that another performer became quieter when an important musician arrived. She might see that a particular room was used for more formal gatherings, while another was used for relaxed conversation. Over time, these observations became part of her internal map of the household. The house was teaching her how to read environments, and reading an environment was almost like reading a person. A room could feel tense. A room could feel celebratory. A room could feel tired. A room could feel expectant. The performer had to recognize the difference. Sometimes the clues were obvious. Sometimes they were extremely subtle. The volume of conversation might change. People might sit differently. Someone might stop laughing. Someone might begin looking toward the door. A senior member might make a small gesture that signaled a change in the evening. The apprentice learnt to notice. This was perhaps one of the greatest differences between an ordinary guest and a professional entertainer. The guest experienced the atmosphere, the performer monitored it. She was inside the experience and simultaneously observing it from the outside. That required concentration. Imagine listening to a conversation while also thinking about the next musical performance, noticing whether a guest needs something, monitoring your posture, remembering a previous conversation, and remaining aware of the senior woman beside you. The performer had to divide her attention without appearing distracted. That kind of multitasking was part of the profession. Yet it could never look like multitasking. The guest was supposed to feel that the performer was completely present. This created another paradox. She had to be attentive to everything while making the individual person feel that he had her full attention. That was a sophisticated social skill. If she constantly looked around the room, the guest might feel ignored. If she focused too intensely on one person, others might feel excluded. The solution was subtle movement of attention, eye contact, a small acknowledgement, a brief smile towards someone else. A question directed to the quieter guest, then back to the main conversation. The room remained balanced. This balance was especially important in group gatherings because social exclusion could quickly create discomfort. A person who had been ignored for too long might become withdrawn. A person who received too much attention might dominate the evening. A performer could correct the imbalance without announcing that anything was wrong. She might ask the quiet person a simple question. She might invite another guest to comment. She might introduce a traditional game that required several people to participate. The intervention looked natural, but it was intentional. This was the art of social choreography. Another unspoken rule concerned the treatment of silence after a question. A beginner might become nervous if the guest did not immediately answer. She might rush to fill the gap. An experienced performer understood that people sometimes needed a moment. A pause did not necessarily mean failure. It could mean thought. It could mean emotion. It could mean that the guest was deciding how much to reveal. The performer learned not to invade every pause. Sometimes patience produced a better conversation. This was especially true when guests spoke about personal memories. Interrupting too quickly could break the emotional rhythm. Allowing someone to finish could make them feel respected. Listening therefore required restraint. You had to resist the urge to demonstrate your own intelligence. The most memorable conversation might not be the one in which the performer said the most. It might be the one in which she helped the guest say something he had wanted to say. This was another reason questions mattered. A well-chosen question could open an entire story. What happened next? How did you first discover that? What did you think at the time? Simple questions could encourage people to continue. The performer became a guide rather than a speaker, and this could make the guest feel important. Making someone feel important was one of the most valuable forms of hospitality. It did not require flattery, it required attention. A person who remembers your story is telling you that your story mattered. A person who remembers your preference is telling you that your presence mattered. A person who recognizes your mood is telling you that you were noticed. These small signals created familiarity, and familiarity could become loyalty. Over time, guests might return because they knew they would be treated with understanding. The house benefited from that loyalty. The performer benefited from the reputation. The relationship became part of the economic structure again. The emotional and commercial sides of the profession were intertwined. A guest could genuinely enjoy the company of a performer while also participating in a commercial system. There was no contradiction. Human relationships often exist within economic environments. The same is true today. The difference is that the historical setting made the connection between hospitality, reputation, and livelihood especially visible. Another rule was to avoid making promises that could not be kept. This may sound obvious, But in a relationship-based profession, a promise carried weight. If a performer said she would remember a particular song, she needed to remember it. If she agreed to appear at a certain time, she needed to make every effort to be there. If she told someone she would pass along a message, forgetting it could damage trust. Reliability was a form of respect, and respect was cumulative. A person who repeatedly kept her word became trusted. A person who repeatedly failed became uncertain. The difference could affect future opportunities. This meant that memory was not simply useful for conversation. Memory was part of professional responsibility. A performer had to remember appointments, names, artistic pieces, seasonal details, household instructions, and social relationships. Her mind was part of her equipment. The same was true of her body. Her posture, hands, voice, balance, and movement were years of training turned the body into something highly controlled. The hands needed to move with precision. The feet needed to move appropriately within traditional footwear. The torso needed to maintain posture. The head needed to turn naturally. The eyes needed to communicate attention without becoming excessive. The voice needed to adapt to the room. The body was always communicating, even when the performer was silent. Her posture could suggest confidence, uncertainty, respect, boredom, or impatience. She had to learn to control those signals. This was especially important because a traditional kimono limited certain movements. The garment encouraged a different physical vocabulary from modern Western clothing. Walking became smaller and more deliberate. Large gestures could become impractical. The sleeves themselves required awareness. The performer therefore learned to work with the clothing rather than against it. The result was a particular style of movement that appeared graceful partly because it was controlled by physical limitations. What looked effortless was partly the result of learning exactly what the clothing allowed. Another hidden rule was to understand the importance of grooming as preparation rather than vanity. Hair, makeup, clothing and accessories were not merely about personal beauty. They formed part of the professional presentation. The preparation could take significant time and mistakes could be costly. A hairstyle could be difficult to arrange. An ornament could break. A garment could require adjustment. Makeup could need correction. Everything had to be ready before the guest arrived. This created a long preparation window. The evening might begin hours before the actual gathering. The guest saw the final result. The household experienced the process. There was another lesson that could take years to understand. The difference between being seen and being remembered. Anyone could attract attention for a few minutes. A striking kimono could attract attention. A beautiful song could attract attention. A clever joke could attract attention. But creating a lasting impression required something deeper. It required consistency. A guest might forget the exact words spoken during an evening. Yet remember how comfortable the room felt, how naturally the conversation flowed, or how effortlessly the performer seemed to understand the mood. That memory could become the foundation of a long-term relationship with the house. This was why the smallest details could matter more than spectacular displays. A performer did not necessarily need to astonish a guest every few minutes. She needed to create an experience that felt complete. The guest should leave without feeling that anything important was missing. The evening should seem balanced, neither rushed nor unnecessarily prolonged. Conversation should have enough energy without becoming exhausting. Music should create atmosphere without drowning out discussion. Food and drink should arrive naturally. The performer should remain attentive without becoming intrusive. Creating that balance required an almost invisible sense of timing. A gathering could begin quietly. Guests might be settling into their surroundings, looking around the room, exchanging polite greetings. The performer did not need to immediately fill every second with entertainment. She could allow people to become comfortable first. A small conversation could establish familiarity. A simple observation could break the initial stiffness. Once the atmosphere became warmer, the entertainment could become more elaborate. The sequence mattered. Beginning too intensely could overwhelm the room. Beginning too quietly could make the evening feel lifeless. The professional learned to find the middle. This was another reason why experience mattered more than memorization. There was no single perfect sequence for every gathering. The correct approach depended on the people present. A formal gathering might require greater restraint. A celebration might allow more playfulness. A gathering of artists might involve more discussion of music or poetry. A group of familiar guests might require less formal introduction. The performer needed to recognize these differences almost immediately. This ability to adapt could become so refined that it seemed intuitive. But intuition itself was often accumulated experience. The performer had seen similar situations before. She recognized patterns. She knew what usually worked and what usually failed. The house therefore produced something that modern people might call emotional intelligence. But it was not learned through abstract theory. It was learned through life. Another unspoken rule was to remember that the guest was not the only person whose comfort mattered. The performer had to consider everyone in the room. If one person became uncomfortable, the atmosphere could affect everyone. If someone was being excluded, the gathering could become divided. If one guest became excessively dominant, others might withdraw. A skilled performer protected the group. This was not always easy because satisfying everyone simultaneously could be impossible. Sometimes one person's wishes conflicted with another's. In such moments, judgment became essential. The performer might give each person attention at different moments. She could redirect a conversation. She could introduce another topic. She could invite another person to participate. She could use music to reset the atmosphere. These actions could appear casual, but they were methods of maintaining social balance. In this sense, the geisha was not simply performing for individuals. She was managing relationships between individuals. That was a much more complicated task, and the ability to do it gracefully was part of what made a highly experienced performer valuable. Another important lesson was that a person's reputation could be shaped by how she treated people who could offer her nothing immediately. It was easy to be polite to an important patron. True professionalism was demonstrated in ordinary interactions as well. How did she treat a younger apprentice? How did she speak to a household attendant? How did she respond to a musician who made a mistake? How did she behave toward a merchant? How did she treat someone who was not the center of attention? These interactions could reveal character. A person who was charming only when powerful guests were present could eventually become known for it. A person who consistently treated others respectfully could develop a stronger reputation. This is another reason why the household itself could function as a training environment for character as much as performance. The apprentice was watched not only during formal events. Her daily behavior mattered. Did she complete her responsibilities? Did she help when needed? Did she show respect? Did she complain constantly? Did she accept correction? Did she take care of her possessions? Did she remember instructions? These ordinary behaviors could influence how others judged her readiness for greater responsibility. Another hidden rule was that complaining could be dangerous when it became habitual. Everyone could become tired. Everyone could dislike a particular task. Everyone could have a difficult day, but constant negativity could affect the atmosphere of the household. The professional learned to distinguish between legitimate difficulty and unnecessary drama. If something was genuinely wrong, it needed to be addressed. If someone was simply frustrated because training was difficult, she might need to learn patience. This distinction was important because discipline could not survive if every inconvenience became a crisis. At the same time, A healthy household needed to recognize genuine problems rather than dismiss everything as weakness. The historical reality was complicated. People were expected to endure difficulty, but they were also dependent upon one another. Support and discipline existed side by side. Another lesson concerned personal possessions. In a shared household, privacy could be limited. Rooms, clothing, instruments, and other belongings existed within a communal environment. This meant that respect for another person's property was essential. You did not casually borrow something without permission. You did not alter someone else's clothing. You did not handle an expensive instrument carelessly. You did not rummage through another person's belongings simply because you were curious. These may sound like ordinary rules, but in a close household they could become extremely important. Trust was built through respecting boundaries. And boundaries were necessary because people lived and worked together for long periods. Another subtle rule was to understand when conversation inside the house was work-related and when it was personal. A performer might need to discuss a guest, a schedule, or a performance. She also needed moments when she could simply talk with people she trusted. The ability to shift between professional and private modes was important. During work, everyone had responsibilities. Afterward, they could relax. But the boundaries were not always perfectly clear. Work relationships could become friendships. Friendships could become complicated by hierarchy. A senior woman could simultaneously be mentor, colleague, and authority figure. A younger apprentice could admire her while also fearing her criticism. These overlapping roles created complicated emotional dynamics. The house was a workplace, but it was also a home. That combination could make relationships unusually intense. You could not simply leave the office at 5 in the afternoon and forget everyone until the next morning. You lived together, you practiced together, you performed together, you shared routines, you saw one another's successes and failures. You therefore learned things about people that ordinary co-workers might never know. This could create deep bonds. It could also create tension. The same closeness that produced friendship could produce conflict. Managing those relationships required maturity. Another unspoken rule was to understand that seniority brought visibility. A beginner could make a small mistake that few people noticed. A senior performer might be judged more harshly because younger women were watching her. Once you became an example, your behavior taught whether you intended to teach or not. A senior performer who constantly arrived late taught that punctuality did not matter. A senior performer who treated guests disrespectfully taught that hierarchy was more important than hospitality. A senior performer who remained calm during difficulty demonstrated resilience. Younger members learned through observation. This meant leadership was partly behavioral. You did not need to give speeches. People watched you. This is why the transition from apprentice to senior performer was more than an increase in technical skill. It was an increase in responsibility. You were no longer learning only for yourself. Your behavior affected people who were learning from you. This could create a strong sense of obligation. A senior woman needed to think about the future of the household. She needed to protect traditions. She needed to help younger women improve. She needed to maintain relationships. She needed to represent the house. The higher her position, the more she carried. Status therefore had two sides. It brought recognition. It also brought responsibility. Another important rule involved accepting that not every evening would be memorable. Some gatherings might be lively. Yet there was still another side to the unspoken code, and it concerned something surprisingly ordinary, knowing how to behave when nothing interesting was happening. The glamorous image of the geisha house naturally draws attention toward performances. Guests, beautiful clothing, music, and lantern-lit evenings. But much of life was made up of ordinary moments. Someone had to wait for a lesson to begin. Someone had to fold clothing. Someone had to practice the same passage again. Someone had to prepare an instrument. Someone had to sit quietly while another person was being taught. Someone had to wake early despite having worked late. The ability to remain disciplined during these ordinary moments was just as important as the ability to shine in public. For an apprentice, boredom could become a test of character. It was easy to work hard when an important guest was arriving and everyone was watching. It was harder to maintain the same standards when nobody seemed to care. But the household understood that professional excellence was built during those unnoticed hours. The dance step practiced when nobody applauded was the step that eventually looked effortless in front of a guest. The musical passage repeated in an empty room was the passage that later sounded beautiful at night. The careful folding of a garment when no one was watching helped preserve something that might later be worn during an important occasion. The house, therefore, taught a difficult principle. Unseen work still mattered. An apprentice might not receive immediate recognition for practicing correctly. She might not receive praise for remembering a minor instruction. She might not receive applause for keeping her room or clothing in order, but these habits accumulated. Eventually, they became part of her reputation. A person who could be trusted with small responsibilities could gradually be trusted with larger ones. This was how confidence was earned. It was not simply declared, it was demonstrated. Another quiet rule was that you should never assume that because something looked simple, it was easy. A graceful bow could take years to perfect. A traditional song might contain rhythms unfamiliar to a beginner. A dance that appeared to involve only a few movements could require precise control of the entire body. Even the art of sitting elegantly could involve posture, balance, clothing, and awareness of the people around you. The more experienced a performer became, the more she understood this hidden complexity. She knew that simplicity was often the result of refinement. The beginner might make a movement large because she was concentrating on completing it. The expert could make the same movement smaller because she had complete control. The beginner might speak more than necessary because she was nervous. The expert could say less because she trusted the silence. The beginner might move quickly because she wanted to prove that she knew what to do. The expert could move slowly because she had nothing to prove. This gradual movement from effort to ease was one of the most important transformations in the training process. And it changed more than performance. It changed personality. A nervous young woman might gradually become composed. Someone who initially struggled to speak in formal settings might become an accomplished conversationalist. Someone who was frightened of making mistakes might learn to recover calmly. Someone who constantly compared herself with others might eventually understand her own strengths. Training could therefore become a process of personal transformation, but it was not necessarily gentle. Traditional apprenticeship systems could be demanding, and expectations around obedience, hierarchy, and discipline could be strict. A young woman entering such a system had to adjust not only her skills, but also her habits. She was learning how to live according to a collective rhythm rather than simply following her own preferences. This could create tension. What she wanted and what the household required were not always identical. She might want to rest when there was still work to do. She might want to wear something she liked when another style was considered more appropriate. She might want to speak freely when the situation required restraint. She might want to move quickly when the environment demanded controlled movement. Learning professionalism meant learning that personal preference was not always the deciding factor. But there was another side to this discipline. Once a performer mastered the system, she gained abilities that could give her greater independence within the profession. She could make decisions because she understood the consequences. She could navigate social situations without constantly relying on someone else. She could become a teacher herself. The discipline that initially felt restrictive could eventually become a source of confidence. That transformation was gradual. At first, rules were external. Later, they became internal. At first, the apprentice thought, "I must do this because someone told me." Eventually, she thought, "I know why this matters." That difference marked maturity. Another important lesson involved the difference between being corrected and being rejected. A young apprentice could easily interpret criticism personally. If a senior woman told her that her posture was wrong, she might feel embarrassed. If she was told to repeat a dance, she might feel that she had failed. But correction was often part of the training. The ability to receive criticism without losing confidence was therefore essential. The apprentice had to learn to say, in effect, "This part of my performance needs improvement," rather than "I am incapable." That psychological separation allowed her to continue learning. A person who could not tolerate correction would stop improving. A person who welcomed useful criticism could become better quickly. The senior women therefore had a responsibility to correct effectively. Too little correction produced mediocrity. Too much humiliation produced fear. The best teaching sat between those extremes. It demanded standards while preserving the student's ability to keep trying. Another unspoken rule was that every senior performer had once been a beginner. This fact could be easy to forget when looking at someone who appeared completely confident. The elegant woman entering the room might have once struggled to remember where to stand. The musician who now played without hesitation might once have missed notes constantly. The experienced conversationalist might once have been terrified of saying the wrong thing. The transformation was hidden because the final performance showed only the finished version. But senior women understood the journey. This could create empathy. A good mentor remembered what it felt like not to know. She knew that some mistakes were natural. She also knew which mistakes could become dangerous if they were not corrected. Her role was therefore both teacher and guardian of standards. Another hidden rule concerned the importance of preparation before entering a guest's presence. A performer could not always improvise her appearance at the last minute. Clothing, hair, makeup, instruments, and mental preparation all had to be considered beforehand. This created a period of transformation. The woman preparing herself was thinking about the person she needed to become for the evening. She checked her appearance. She considered the occasion. She remembered who would be present. She thought about the performances. She prepared her mind. Then she entered. The transition from private preparation to public presentation was almost ritualistic. Once the door opened, hesitation had to disappear. The guest should see confidence. Even if the performer had been nervous moments earlier, she needed to enter with composure. This was not necessarily dishonesty. It was professional discipline. Actors do something similar when they step onto a stage. Musicians do it before performing. Speakers do it before addressing an audience. The private person may feel uncertainty. The professional role requires control. The Geisha house turned that transformation into an everyday practice. Another rule concerned the importance of the first impression. The opening moments of a gathering established expectations. A respectful greeting could immediately create warmth. A careless greeting could make the entire evening feel awkward. The performer, therefore, had to be especially attentive at the beginning. She needed to recognize who had arrived. She needed to understand the social relationships. She needed to know whether the gathering was formal or relaxed. She needed to avoid appearing either too distant or too familiar. The opening was not the time for unnecessary experimentation. It was the time to establish trust. Once trust existed, the atmosphere could become more relaxed. This created another subtle sequence. Formality first, familiarity later. The guest needed to understand that the performer respected the occasion before she could become playful. The performer could gradually adjust as the room became more comfortable. This progression was almost like warming up before music. The first notes were controlled. Later, the performance could become more expressive. Conversation worked in a similar way at first, polite topics, then shared humor, then more personal stories if the relationship allowed it. The performer had to know how quickly or slowly to move through those stages. Too quickly could feel intrusive. Too slowly could feel cold. Again, timing mattered. Another hidden rule was to understand that not every guest needed to be impressed. Some guests already understood the traditions. The household also taught an apprentice that reputation could be built through things that no guest would ever notice. A person might remember the beautiful performance at night, but the household remembered whether the performer had prepared properly beforehand. It remembered whether she had arrived on time, whether she had treated others respectfully, whether she had taken care of her clothing, whether she had practiced when nobody was watching, and whether she could remain calm when something unexpected happened. Public elegance was only one part of professional character. Private discipline was the foundation underneath it. This created an unusual relationship. The more accomplished a performer became, the less visible her effort often appeared. A beginner might concentrate so intensely on every movement that her concentration was obvious. An experienced woman could perform the same movement while appearing completely relaxed. The audience might assume that she possessed effortless grace. In reality, the effort had not disappeared. It had simply moved into years of training. The same thing happened with conversation. A beginner might carefully think about every question before asking it. She might worry about whether a topic was appropriate. She might become nervous when a guest answered unexpectedly. With experience, she could listen more naturally because she had encountered hundreds of different conversational situations. She no longer needed to calculate every possibility. She recognized patterns. Simone becomes quiet. Change the subject. Simone becomes excited. Let them continue. Simone asks about a tradition. Explain briefly. Simone tells a long story. Listen without interrupting. Simone makes a mistake. Protect them. Simone needs attention. Include them. Simone wants space. Give it. The rules became almost invisible because experience turned them into instinct. This ability to recognize patterns was one of the most valuable things an apprentice could develop. The house was full of repetition, but repetition did not necessarily mean that every day was identical. Instead, the same basic situations appeared in slightly different forms. Every new guest provided another variation. Every performance introduced another possibility. Every mistake created another lesson. Over time, the apprentice accumulated a mental library of experiences. She remembered the guest who had been extremely talkative. She remembered the guest who preferred music. She remembered the evening when an instrument unexpectedly failed. She remembered the gathering that became much more formal than expected. She remembered the night when a younger performer became nervous and needed help. She remembered the time when she herself made an embarrassing mistake and discovered that the world did not end. These memories became practical knowledge. The most useful lessons were sometimes the ones learned from failure. Success could confirm that something worked, but failure forced a person to understand why something had gone wrong. A missed cue could teach timing. An awkward conversation could teach restraint. A poorly chosen topic could teach sensitivity. A forgotten name could teach the importance of preparation. The mature performer did not necessarily try to avoid every mistake. She tried to avoid repeating the same mistake. That was a much more realistic definition of professionalism. Another unspoken rule involved learning how to recover from embarrassment without allowing it to become the center of attention. Everyone makes mistakes, but public embarrassment can become larger when a person reacts dramatically to it. A performer who drops something might immediately become flustered, apologize repeatedly, and draw everyone's attention to the incident. An experienced performer could acknowledge it briefly, correct it, and continue. The difference could be only a few seconds. Confidence was partly the ability to allow an imperfect moment to remain small. The guest might forget the incident 5 minutes later. The performer might remember it for years. This was why emotional discipline mattered. A mistake could feel enormous to the person who made it while being almost invisible to everyone else. The ability to understand that difference could prevent unnecessary anxiety. Another lesson concerned the importance of not becoming overly attached to a particular image of oneself. A performer might become known for elegance, humor, music, or a certain style of conversation. Recognition could be rewarding, but it could also become a trap if she believed she had to behave the same way forever. People change, skills develop, interests evolve. A performer who had been famous for one particular ability might eventually discover another. The household needed continuity, but the individual still needed room to grow. This created a delicate balance between reputation and development. A strong reputation could open doors, but if a performer became too dependent upon maintaining one image, she might resist learning. The best professionals remained curious. They continued studying. They continued listening. They continued observing younger performers. They continued learning from musicians, and experience did not mean believing that there was nothing left to learn. It meant understanding how much there still was to learn. Another hidden rule involved the treatment of artistic knowledge as something valuable, but not something to boast about constantly. A performer might know traditional songs, dances, poetry, history, seasonal customs, instruments, etiquette, and social traditions. But displaying knowledge merely to prove intelligence could make conversation feel unnatural. Knowledge was most useful when it served the moment. If a guest showed interest in a particular tradition, the performer could explain it. If the conversation moved elsewhere, she could leave the subject. This was another form of restraint. A person who truly understands something does not always need to demonstrate it. She knows when the information matters. This principle applied to performance as well. A technically difficult movement might be impressive, but if it disrupted the mood, it might not belong in that particular evening. Artistic judgment meant choosing the right level of complexity. The most sophisticated performance was not necessarily the most complicated. Sometimes, simplicity required greater confidence. A single movement performed perfectly could be more memorable than an elaborate sequence performed without emotional connection. The audience might not know why it felt powerful. The performer did. She understood the relationship between technique and atmosphere. Another rule involved understanding the physical space itself. The room was not simply a background. Its size, arrangement, lighting, sound, and seating influenced how people behaved. A performer needed to be aware of where she was in relation to the guests and other performers. A movement that worked beautifully in one room might feel cramped in another. A conversation that was easy in a small group might become difficult in a crowded space. Music might carry differently depending on the room. Even the placement of people could influence who spoke and who remained quiet. The experienced performer therefore developed spatial awareness. She knew where to position herself. She knew when to move. She knew how much room a dance required. She knew how to avoid blocking someone else. She understood that physical space could shape social space. This was another part of the invisible choreography. The room itself became a participant. Another important lesson was that the entrance and exit of a person could change the atmosphere. When an important guest arrived, the room might become more formal. When that person left, everyone could relax slightly. The performer needed to adjust without making the change obvious. This required awareness of hierarchy and context. She had to recognize not only who had arrived, but what their arrival meant for everyone else. That was another reason observation was more important than memorization. A list of names could tell you who someone was. Observation could tell you how the room responded to them. That difference mattered. Another hidden rule was to avoid making assumptions about someone's mood based only on appearance. A smiling person could be nervous. A quiet person could be perfectly comfortable. Someone who seemed serious could be deeply interested. The performer had to watch for multiple signals: tone, posture, eye movements, speech, timing, facial expression, participation. No single signal told the entire story. Social intelligence involved combining them. This was especially useful when guests were unfamiliar with the environment. A person might appear reserved simply because he did not know the customs. Instead of interpreting that as dislike, the performer could create opportunities for comfortable participation. A simple explanation, a gentle invitation, a small joke, a familiar topic. Gradually, the guest could relax. The performer had helped transform unfamiliarity into comfort. That was one of the central purposes of hospitality. Another unspoken rule involved understanding that the guest's experience began before the formal performance. The way someone was welcomed, seated, and introduced could influence the entire evening. If the opening felt chaotic, the guest might remain uncomfortable, even if the later entertainment was excellent. Preparation therefore began before the first song. The room had to be ready. The people had to know their responsibilities. The sequence had to be understood. The performer needed to know who was expected. Morning inside the household could reveal a completely different world from the one visitors imagined at night. The lanterns were gone. The formal atmosphere had disappeared, and the rooms no longer felt like stages. Yet the discipline remained. The day began with practical responsibilities: preparation, lessons, and the quiet restoration of everything that had been used the previous evening. The contrast was striking at night. The household could appear mysterious and elegant. In the morning, it was a workplace filled with ordinary tasks. This was another unspoken rule: never confuse the finished appearance with the work required to create it. The beauty of the previous evening had to be maintained. Clothing needed care. Personal items needed organization. Musical instruments needed attention. Rooms needed to be prepared. Lessons needed to continue. Appointments needed to be remembered. The fact that guests were absent did not mean the household had stopped functioning. In some ways, the morning could be even more important, because it was when the foundations of the next evening were built. An apprentice who wanted to become accomplished could not think only about performance. She had to develop habits that supported performance. She needed to understand that artistic skill depended upon practical discipline. If she misplaced an important item, preparation became difficult. If she forgot a lesson, improvement slowed. If she neglected her clothing, the problem eventually became visible. If she failed to rest properly, concentration suffered. Everything was connected. This taught another quiet principle: professionalism begins long before anyone sees you. A guest might see the final hour. The performer had already lived through many hours of preparation. The public performance was therefore the tip of a much larger structure. The same was true of learning. An apprentice might eventually perform a traditional piece in a few minutes, but the journey to that performance could involve countless repetitions. She might practice a movement until her body understood it without conscious thought. She might repeat a musical passage until the rhythm became natural. She might study the correct manner of holding an object, moving through a room, or responding to a guest. The repetition could seem almost boring, But boredom was part of mastery. The body needed repetition to remember. The mind needed repetition to recognize patterns. The emotions needed repetition to become less reactive. The apprentice was not simply practicing an artistic technique. She was training herself to remain calm while performing that technique. This was important because pressure changes behavior. A person can perform perfectly in private and become nervous in public. The solution is not always more knowledge. Sometimes the solution is more experience under pressure. The household gradually exposed apprentices to real situations so that public performance became less frightening. At first, they might simply observe. Then they might assist. Then they might perform small portions. Eventually, they could carry greater responsibility. The progression was gradual because confidence had to be earned. Another unspoken rule involved learning from people who possessed different kinds of knowledge. A performer could not assume that the most visible person was the only teacher. A musician might teach something about rhythm. A clothing specialist might teach something about fabric and movement. A senior performer might teach etiquette. Someone responsible for daily household organization might teach practical efficiency. Each person possessed a different piece of the larger system. An intelligent apprentice watched everyone. She did not assume that knowledge always came from the person with the highest status. This was an important lesson in humility. Sometimes the person performing the least visible task understood something the performer herself did not. Recognizing that prevented arrogance, it also strengthened cooperation. A person who respected other people's expertise was easier to work with. Another hidden rule was that the household's appearance depended upon everyone's reliability. If one person failed to prepare something, another person might have to compensate. This could create unnecessary stress. Therefore, completing one's responsibility was also a way of showing respect for co-workers. You were not simply finishing your own task. You were protecting someone else's ability to do theirs. This is how collective professionalism works. One person prepares the clothing. Another prepares the music. Another organizes the room. Another manages the schedule. Another performs. Each depends upon the others. The final experience belongs to everyone. This made cooperation more important than individual brilliance. A spectacular performer who constantly disrupted the team could become a problem. A less flashy performer who was reliable, respectful, and cooperative could become extremely valuable. The household needed both talent and stability. Another subtle rule concerned the use of resources. Traditional clothing, instruments, and decorations could be expensive and delicate. Carelessness was therefore more than a personal mistake. It could create financial consequences. An apprentice had to learn to treat valuable objects with respect. She needed to understand how to handle fabric, how to store things properly, how to avoid unnecessary damage, how to prepare objects before use, how to return them afterward. This created another connection between discipline and economics. The artistic world depended upon material resources. Beauty had a cost. Someone had to produce the fabric. Someone had to make the instrument. The performer therefore needed to understand that artistry existed inside an economic system. This is one reason the geisha profession cannot be understood purely as entertainment. It involved business relationships, training, artistic production, hospitality, and social networks. The household itself functioned as an economic institution. Reputation mattered because reputation affected demand. Demand affected income. Income supported the household. The household supported training. Training produced performers. The cycle continued. Another unspoken rule was that money itself was often something to handle with discretion. Financial matters could influence relationships, but discussing them carelessly could make interactions uncomfortable. The performer needed to understand that hospitality had a commercial foundation without making every conversation feel like a transaction. This required subtlety. A guest could understand that the evening involved payment without needing constant reminders of it. The experience had to feel relational rather than mechanical. At the same time, the household needed to remain economically viable. This balance between warmth and business was one of the profession's hidden complexities. The performer was not simply entertaining for pleasure. She was participating in a livelihood. The house was not simply a beautiful residence. It was a workplace. And the artistic skills were not merely hobbies. They were professional assets. Another important lesson was that an apprentice needed to understand the value of punctuality, not only as personal discipline, but as consideration for other people. If one person arrived late, someone else might have to wait. A lesson might be delayed, a performance. A guest might notice being on time communicated something without words. It said, "I understand that your time matters." That was another form of respect. Likewise, being prepared communicated reliability. You did not want the person beside you to wonder whether you had remembered your responsibility. This was why seemingly ordinary habits could become central to professional identity. Another rule involved the importance of keeping promises realistic. A young performer might be eager to please and therefore promise too much, but failing to deliver could damage trust. A mature professional learned to make commitments carefully. If she was uncertain, she could ask someone. If she could not guarantee something, she should not pretend otherwise. Honesty protected reliability. It was better to say that something needed confirmation than to confidently promise something impossible. This kind of judgment became increasingly important as the performer gained responsibility. The more people depended on her, the more carefully she needed to manage commitments. Another hidden lesson was that a good performer needed to know how to wait. Waiting was not always passive. It could involve observing, preparing, listening, or mentally rehearsing. An apprentice might spend time waiting for her opportunity. Instead of becoming restless, she could watch the senior performer. She could notice how the guest reacted. She could prepare herself. She could learn from what was happening around her. Waiting became another form of education. This was especially important in a hierarchical environment where the younger person could not always act immediately. The ability to wait without appearing impatient was itself a social skill. It communicated respect for timing. It also prevented unnecessary interruptions. Another rule involved knowing how to enter a conversation already in progress. Suddenly speaking could be disruptive. Interrupting could create awkwardness. The performer needed to recognize a natural opening. This might mean waiting for someone to finish, making eye contact, receiving an acknowledgement, then speaking. Huge details may seem trivial today, but in a formal environment, they could distinguish polished behavior from clumsy behavior. There was another dimension to this hidden education that became increasingly important as an apprentice grew older. Learning how to recognize the difference between what was urgent and what could wait. In a household where several responsibilities could exist at the same time, everything might appear important. A garment might need attention. A lesson might be approaching. Someone might need assistance. A guest might be arriving. An instrument might require preparation. Without judgment, a person could become overwhelmed. The experienced performer learnt to prioritize. She did not panic simply because several things needed to be done. She looked at the situation. What must happen immediately? What can be handled afterward? Who needs to be informed? Who can help? what can be ignored temporarily. This ability to establish priorities was another form of invisible professionalism. It also protected the atmosphere. Guests should not see a household struggling to organize itself. If something unexpected happened, the performers and attendants needed to divide responsibilities quickly. One person could handle the immediate problem. Another could continue the planned activity. Another could quietly inform someone senior. The evening continued. This was teamwork without unnecessary discussion. An apprentice watching such a situation could learn more in 5 minutes than she might learn from a long lecture. She would see how experienced people remained calm. She would see how they communicated. She would see how they protected one another. She would understand that competence was not simply knowing what to do when everything went according to plan. It was knowing what to do when the plan changed. That lesson could stay with her for the rest of her career. Another unspoken rule was that preparation should include imagining possible problems before they happened. A performer might think about what could go wrong and quietly prepare a solution. What if the guest arrives early? What if another guest arrives unexpectedly? What if a piece of clothing needs adjustment? What if a musician is delayed? What if the conversation becomes uncomfortable? What if the planned entertainment no longer suits the mood? The experienced performer did not necessarily worry about all of these possibilities. She simply knew that they existed. That awareness reduced panic. Preparedness was not pessimism. It was confidence based on anticipation. This was particularly useful because public performance leaves little room for visible confusion. The audience does not want to watch the performer solve every logistical problem. They want to experience the result. Therefore, preparation had to happen beforehand whenever possible. Another important rule concerned the use of objects in the room. Traditional interiors often relied upon carefully chosen arrangements, and objects could carry seasonal, artistic, or symbolic meaning. A performer needed to understand that decoration was not merely decoration. A flower arrangement could communicate the season. A painting could influence the atmosphere. A particular object could relate to an occasion. The placement of an item could create visual balance. The performer did not necessarily arrange everything herself, but she needed enough cultural awareness to understand what she was seeing. This knowledge could also provide conversation. A guest might notice something and ask about it. The performer could explain. The room itself became a source of storytelling. That meant the environment was nothing needed to be excessive. A small detail could be enough. This was another example of the principle that subtlety could be more powerful than abundance. Another hidden lesson was that a performer should never become so accustomed to beautiful surroundings that she stopped appreciating them. Familiarity can make extraordinary things seem ordinary. A young apprentice might initially be fascinated by elaborate garments, instruments, decorations, and performances. After years, those things could become routine. Yet maintaining appreciation was important because genuine appreciation affected performance. If the performer treated everything as meaningless routine, her work could become mechanical. The most accomplished artists often retained curiosity. They continued noticing details. They continued appreciating craftsmanship. They continued asking questions. They continued learning. Experience did not have to destroy wonder. It could deepen it. The apprentice who eventually understood the history behind a particular garment might appreciate it more, not less. The musician who understood the structure of a traditional piece might hear more inside it. The dancer who understood the meaning behind a movement could perform it with greater emotional depth. Knowledge could make beauty more visible. Another rule involved learning to distinguish between admiration and attachment. A performer could admire a beautiful object without treating it carelessly as though it were ordinary. She could admire a talented colleague without becoming consumed by comparison. She could appreciate a guest without allowing professional boundaries to disappear. This ability to appreciate without becoming possessive was another form of emotional maturity. The household required people to interact with beauty constantly. Without emotional discipline, admiration could become jealousy, attachment, or insecurity. The professional learned to appreciate what was valuable while maintaining balance. Another hidden rule concerned the way apprentices were expected to carry themselves even when they were tired. Fatigue could affect posture, expression, and movement. Before a person consciously realized it, a senior performer might notice immediately. Lift your posture. Slow down. Pay attention. Do not let your tiredness enter the room. The lesson was not that exhaustion was imaginary. It was that the guest should not be forced to carry it. This distinction between private fatigue and public responsibility could be difficult. The performer had to learn to preserve energy before the evening became overwhelming. Rest during appropriate periods became important. Eating properly mattered. Preparing clothing early mattered. Avoiding unnecessary exertion mattered. Professional endurance was partly about managing resources. The body was one of the tools of the profession. It had to be maintained. Another lesson concerned the voice. A performer could not speak continuously at maximum volume or intensity. The voice needed control. A quiet room allowed a quieter voice. A larger gathering required greater projection. A serious conversation might call for a softer tone. A playful moment might involve more energy. The voice could shape the atmosphere as strongly as music. Experienced performers understood that tone could communicate more than words. A sentence could sound warm, cold, teasing, formal, or dismissive, depending on how it was delivered. Therefore, speech training was not simply about vocabulary. It was about tone, pace, volume, pause, emphasis, silence. A skilled conversationalist used all of these. Another unspoken rule was to avoid speaking too quickly when a guest needed time to understand something. Traditional expressions, artistic references, or unfamiliar customs could require explanation. Rushing through them could make the guest feel lost. The performer learned to adjust her pace to the listener. This was another form of empathy. You were not speaking merely to express yourself. You were speaking so that another person could understand. That distinction seems obvious, but it changes how conversation works. Another important lesson involved knowing when a guest had understood enough. Over-explaining could make a simple matter unnecessarily complicated. The performer needed to recognize when to stop. Again, moderation. A brief explanation, then experience. If the guest wanted more information, he could ask. This allowed curiosity to guide the depth of conversation. Another hidden rule concerned the handling of praise from guests. A guest might compliment a performer's appearance, music, or conversation. The performer could accept graciously without becoming self-conscious or overly boastful. A simple acknowledgement was often enough. The purpose was not to reject the compliment. It was to accept it without allowing the conversation to become entirely about herself. She could redirect naturally. Thank you. Then continue. This demonstrated confidence. Someone who constantly denied every compliment could make the guest uncomfortable. Someone who constantly praised herself could appear arrogant. The middle ground was graceful acceptance. Another lesson involved understanding that compliments could sometimes be strategic. A guest might praise someone because he genuinely admired her. He might also be trying to create closeness. He might simply be being polite. The performer did not need to analyze every compliment obsessively. She could receive it graciously and continue observing the broader context. This prevented her from becoming dependent upon verbal approval. Again, Emotional independence mattered. Another hidden rule concerned criticism from guests. Not every complaint was justified, but every complaint could provide information. If a guest disliked the music, perhaps the selection was unsuitable. If he felt ignored, perhaps the performer had overlooked someone. If he was dissatisfied with the pace, perhaps the evening had become too long. The professional listened. She did not automatically assume the guest was correct. She also did not automatically assume he was wrong. She considered the situation. This was another form of judgment. The household also taught that reputation was not something a person owned permanently. It had to be maintained through ordinary behavior, and this could be one of the hardest lessons for a young performer to accept. After a successful evening, it was natural to feel that she had finally proven herself. But the next morning, the household did not suddenly become easier. There were still lessons, preparations, responsibilities, and expectations. Yesterday's applause could not substitute for today's discipline. A performer could be admired one night and still receive correction the next morning. This was not necessarily cruelty. It was a reminder that professional standards did not disappear simply because someone had succeeded. The same principle applied to seniority. Becoming experienced did not mean becoming exempt from the expectations imposed on everyone else. In fact, greater experience often meant greater responsibility. A senior woman was expected to understand situations more quickly, notice problems earlier, and help maintain the atmosphere of the household. She was no longer responsible only for herself. Younger women might be watching her. If she became careless, others could imitate her. If she remained disciplined, she demonstrated what the profession expected. This made senior performers living examples of the rules. An apprentice might forget a spoken instruction, but she would remember what she repeatedly saw. If the senior woman treated an instrument carefully, the apprentice learned to do the same. If she listened patiently to guests, the apprentice learned patience. If she handled mistakes calmly, the apprentice learned recovery. If she treated junior members with dignity, the apprentice learned how authority could be used responsibly. Behavior taught more effectively than lectures. This was why the presence of a respected senior performer could influence an entire household without her saying very much. Another hidden rule concerned the way apprentices were expected to observe before they participated. Modern people are often encouraged to speak up immediately, ask questions immediately, and demonstrate their abilities immediately. Inside a traditional apprenticeship, however, observation could come first. A young woman might spend considerable time simply watching. She watched how a room was prepared. She watched how an experienced performer entered. She watched where she sat. She watched how she greeted people. She watched how a conversation developed. She watched how music was introduced. She watched how the evening ended. At first, she might not understand why certain actions happened, but repeated observation gradually revealed patterns. The senior woman did not need to explain everything. The apprentice learned by seeing. This method could be frustrating because it required patience. A beginner naturally wants to participate. Watching can feel like doing nothing, but observation was not inactivity. It was information gathering. Every detail became another piece of knowledge. Eventually, the apprentice could predict what would happen next. That was when observation had become understanding. Another unspoken rule was to avoid drawing attention to another person's mistake. If someone stumbled over a word, dropped something, or forgot part of a performance, openly reacting could make the situation worse. The professional learned to help the person recover without making the mistake larger. Sometimes this meant continuing as though nothing had happened. Sometimes it meant quietly providing assistance. Sometimes it meant changing the focus of the room. The goal was to preserve dignity. This principle could be especially important when dealing with guests. A guest who made an unfamiliar etiquette mistake did not necessarily need to be corrected publicly. A performer could quietly guide the situation in another direction. The person could learn without feeling humiliated. That was sophisticated hospitality. It recognized that people are often more comfortable learning when they are not being made to feel ignorant. Another lesson concerned the importance of protecting younger members from unnecessary pressure while still preparing them for responsibility. An apprentice needed opportunities to experience real situations, but throwing her into every difficult circumstance could be counterproductive. Training had to be gradual. A young woman might first observe a formal gathering. Later, she might assist with small tasks. Eventually, she might perform a limited role. After gaining confidence, she could take greater responsibility. Each stage gave her another layer of experience. The transition was not simply about age, it was about readiness. Could she maintain composure? Could she remember instructions? Could she adapt? Could she interact respectfully? Could she recover from mistakes? Could she understand the atmosphere? When the answer became yes often enough, responsibility increased. This progression created a sense of achievement. The apprentice could look backward and realize how far she had come. Another hidden rule was that a professional should never become visibly annoyed simply because someone else was slower to understand something. This applied particularly to teaching. Every student learned differently. One person might understand movement quickly but struggle with music. Another might remember songs easily but have difficulty with formal behavior. Another might need repeated demonstrations. Patience was therefore part of teaching. A senior performer who had forgotten how difficult learning could be might become harsh. A better teacher remembered her own beginnings. She understood that mastery had once seemed impossible to her too. This memory could make correction more compassionate. Yet compassion did not mean the student still had to improve. The teacher's role was to make improvement possible. Another important rule involved knowing the difference between encouragement and false reassurance. Telling a beginner that everything was excellent when it clearly was not would not help her. Real encouragement could sound more like this: "You are improving. That part is much better. Your timing is stronger now. Keep practicing this section." Such statements were honest. They acknowledged progress without pretending that the work was finished. This balance could build genuine confidence. The apprentice learned that she did not need to be perfect to be progressing. Progress itself was enough reason to continue. Another hidden lesson concerned the importance of not comparing one's beginning with someone else's finished career. A young apprentice might look at a highly experienced performer and feel inadequate. She might think, "Why can she do this so naturally while I struggle?" But she was comparing her early stage with someone else's years of experience. The senior woman's effortless appearance was built on countless repetitions. The apprentice had not yet completed. Understanding this could prevent discouragement. Every expert had once been uncertain. Every master had once needed correction. Every polished performance had a first attempt. The difference was time and persistence. Another rule involved understanding that some skills developed unevenly. A performer might improve rapidly in one area and slowly in another. This was normal. Human development is rarely perfectly balanced. The apprentice needed to continue strengthening weaknesses without ignoring strengths. If she was naturally talented in music, she still needed discipline. If she struggled with dance, she needed patience. If she was naturally outgoing, she needed restraint. If she was shy, she needed confidence. Training was partly about balancing personality. The goal was not to erase natural qualities. It was to refine them. Another hidden rule concerned the importance of maintaining a professional identity, even when relationships became emotionally complicated. People who worked closely together could naturally develop strong friendships, rivalries, or personal attachments. Those emotions were unavoidable, but professional responsibilities remained. If two performers disagreed personally, they still needed to cooperate when a guest arrived. If one person was jealous of another's success, she still needed to behave graciously. If a teacher was frustrated with a student, she still had to teach responsibly. The household required emotional compartmentalization. Personal feelings could exist without controlling professional behavior. That was difficult, but it was essential. Another lesson involved knowing when to bring a private disagreement to a senior person. Not every conflict needed intervention. Some could be resolved directly, but if a problem began affecting the household's functioning, ignoring it could make things worse. Judgment meant knowing when a disagreement had crossed that line. This required humility. Sometimes people avoided asking for help because they feared looking weak, but seeking assistance before a problem became serious could actually demonstrate responsibility. A mature person knew when she could solve something herself and when she needed support. Another hidden rule concerned the importance of keeping the household physically orderly. Order was not merely aesthetic, it reduced mistakes. When everything had a place, people could find what they needed quickly. When clothing was prepared properly, dressing became easier. When instruments were stored correctly, preparation took less time. When schedules were organized, confusion decreased. Physical order created mental order. For an apprentice, learning to maintain her environment was therefore part of professional training. There was also an unspoken understanding that the household could never afford to become careless, simply because an evening had become familiar. Familiarity was one of the greatest dangers to professionalism. When the same rooms were entered every day, the same clothing was handled repeatedly, and the same routines were performed again and again. It was easy to stop noticing details, yet the smallest details were often the ones that separated an experienced professional from someone who was merely going through the motions. An apprentice was therefore encouraged to keep looking at familiar things as though they were new. She had to notice whether something had changed. A guest's mood could be different from the last time. A room could feel different because of the season. A garment could require different handling. A musical performance could, even the same person could behave differently depending on the circumstances. The lesson was simple but difficult. Never assume that yesterday's answer will automatically work today. This principle made observation more important than routine. Routine provided structure, but observation allowed adaptation. A skilled performer could follow the familiar structure of an evening, while remaining sensitive to everything unusual within it. She could recognize that the guest was quieter than usual, that another person seemed unusually energetic, or that the atmosphere required more conversation than performance. Nothing needed to be announced. The performer simply adjusted. This ability to adjust without making the adjustment visible was one of the finest examples of professional skill. Another hidden rule involved avoiding unnecessary displays of authority. A senior woman could have considerable influence inside the household, but constantly reminding younger members of her position would not necessarily make her respected. Genuine authority was demonstrated through competence. If she knew what to do when something went wrong, people listened. If she taught effectively, people respected her. If she protected the household's reputation, people trusted her. If she remained calm under pressure, people looked to her. Authority became natural when it was supported by ability. This also meant that a senior woman could sometimes correct someone without raising her voice. A short sentence, a glance, or a small gesture could be enough because the relationship already carried meaning. For the apprentice, learning to recognize these subtle signals was another part of education. Not every instruction arrived as a long explanation. Sometimes the lesson was contained in a gesture. Sometimes the absence of a gesture was the lesson. If a senior woman did not interrupt, perhaps the apprentice was expected to continue. If she paused, perhaps the apprentice needed to notice something. If she quietly moved an object, perhaps she was demonstrating a better way to organize the room. The apprentice learned to pay attention to these details. This could make the household feel almost like a language that had to be learned. There were words, but there were also pauses. There were gestures. There were expressions. There were patterns of movement. There were moments when everyone seemed to understand something without saying it. The newcomer initially felt confused. Eventually, another unspoken rule was that a person should not deliberately make another person look inexperienced. This was especially important when younger performers were beginning to appear before guests. If an apprentice forgot something, a senior woman could quietly assist, rather than openly announcing the mistake. If a younger performer became nervous, an experienced colleague could redirect attention. If someone struggled with a performance, the others could help maintain the overall atmosphere. The objective was not to hide incompetence forever. The apprentice still needed correction later. But public humiliation rarely produced the best learning environment. The lesson could be delivered privately, where the student could concentrate on improvement rather than embarrassment. This created a distinction between correction and punishment. Correction was about making the person better. Punishment was about making the person suffer for the mistake. A thoughtful teacher understood the difference. Another important rule involved the handling of personal possessions in a household where people lived and worked closely together. Objects could easily be misplaced or borrowed. Respecting another person's belongings was therefore part of basic trust. An apprentice learned not to touch something simply because it was interesting. She learned to ask before borrowing. She learned to return things properly. She learned to remember where they belonged. These habits might sound ordinary, but they created an atmosphere in which people could trust one another. Trust grows through small behaviors. Someone who repeatedly returns things correctly becomes reliable. Someone who repeatedly takes without asking becomes difficult to trust. The household noticed these patterns. Another lesson concerned the way an apprentice should respond when she did not understand an instruction. Pretending to understand could be more dangerous than admitting confusion. If she misunderstood a preparation detail, the mistake might affect an entire evening. If she misunderstood a performance instruction, she might practice incorrectly for days. Therefore, asking for clarification at the appropriate moment was valuable, but timing remained important. The apprentice needed to listen carefully first. She should not ask a question that had already been answered. She should not interrupt unnecessarily. She should think about the instruction before asking. This encouraged active listening rather than passive obedience. The goal was not simply to hear instructions. It was to understand them. Another hidden rule involved learning to recognize the difference between advice and criticism. A senior woman might point out a weakness because she wanted the apprentice to improve. The apprentice had to avoid automatically interpreting every correction as personal rejection. This could be especially difficult for someone young. A harsh sounding instruction might stay in her mind long after the lesson ended. With experience, she could begin separating the emotional tone from the useful information. What exactly was being corrected? Was the criticism about the technique, the timing, the posture, the attitude, the preparation? Once she separated the useful information from her emotional reaction, she could improve. This was another form of Another unspoken rule was that improvement should eventually become self-directed. In the beginning, a teacher constantly pointed out errors. Later, the student needed to notice them herself. This was a major transition. Instead of waiting for the teacher to say, "Your posture is wrong," the apprentice should feel that something was wrong before the teacher spoke. Instead of waiting to be told that a song needed more practice, she should already know. Instead of waiting for someone to remind her about preparation, she should have prepared. That was the moment when dependence began turning into professionalism. The teacher no longer needed to supervise every detail. The student had developed an internal standard. This internal standard was perhaps more important than any external rule. Another lesson concerned how to behave when a guest complimented someone else. The natural impulse might be to redirect attention toward oneself or to compete with the praise. The mature response was to allow the compliment to exist. If another performer had done something beautiful, it was perfectly acceptable to let her receive recognition. The room did not need constant competition. A confident person could appreciate another person's excellence without feeling threatened. This created a more generous atmosphere. It also allowed guests to enjoy different performers for different reasons. Zone might be especially gifted at music. Another might have remarkable conversational ability. Another might excel at dance. The household could offer variety. No one needed to be everything. Another hidden rule involved understanding that an apprentice's behavior could affect the people who trained her. If she behaved carelessly in public, guests might not distinguish between her and the household that taught her. Her actions could therefore reflect on her teachers. This created a sense of responsibility. She carried more than her own reputation. She carried part of the reputation of those who had invested in her. That could be a powerful motivation. At the same time, teachers also carried responsibility for the people they trained. If an apprentice struggled, the teacher could not simply blame the student for everything. The teacher had to consider whether the training was effective. Was the instruction clear? Was the student receiving enough practice? Was she being given the right responsibilities? Was she overwhelmed? Good education required responsibility on both sides. Another important rule concerned the preservation of attention during long gatherings. Human concentration naturally fluctuates. A performer could not expect everyone to remain equally attentive for hours. This was why variety mattered. Conversation could give way to music. Music could give way to a game. A serious topic could give way to humor. A quiet moment could be followed by something more energetic. The evening needed movement, but that movement had to feel natural rather than mechanical. The performer learned to sense when the audience needed a change. This was another form of timing. The room itself gave signals. The deeper the apprentice entered the life of the household, the more she discovered that many of its most important rules concerned things that appeared completely ordinary. How a door was opened, how a garment was placed down, how someone was greeted after an absence, how a cup was handled, how long a person waited before speaking. None of these actions seemed important when considered separately, yet together they created the atmosphere of the house. The household's character was expressed through hundreds of tiny habits that visitors might never consciously notice. One of the first things an apprentice learned was that carelessness had a way of multiplying. A small mistake made early in the day could create several larger problems later. A garment left in the wrong place might not be found when needed. An instrument that was not prepared could delay a performance. An appointment that was not properly remembered could create confusion. A message that was passed inaccurately could affect several people. The solution was not to become frightened of mistakes. It was to become attentive. Attention was one of the quiet currencies of the household. A person who paid attention could prevent problems before they appeared. She noticed what others missed. She remembered what had been said. She recognized when something was unusual. She knew when to ask for help. An apprentice who developed strong attention could become valuable even before she became highly accomplished artistically. People could trust her, and trust was one of the foundations of professional life. Another unspoken rule was that trust had to be earned repeatedly. One successful evening did not automatically make someone reliable. A person became trusted through patterns. She arrived when expected. She prepared properly. She remembered instructions. She treated belongings carefully. She protected private information. She accepted correction. She helped when needed. She did not create unnecessary drama. Over time, these small behaviors created a reputation. People began to think, if she is responsible for this, it will probably be handled. That sentence represented a tremendous achievement. It meant the performer no longer needed constant supervision. She had become dependable. Another important lesson involved the danger of assuming that a person who was quiet was less intelligent or less capable in a formal environment. Some of the most observant people might speak very little. They were watching. They were collecting information. They were waiting for the right moment. An apprentice could learn much by observing people who did not dominate conversations. Sometimes the person who said the least noticed the most. This was another reason restraint was valuable. Silence did not necessarily mean weakness. It could mean attention. It could mean thoughtfulness. It could mean or it could simply mean that there was nothing necessary to say. The professional learned to distinguish these possibilities rather than judging too quickly. Another hidden rule concerned the importance of remembering that every guest arrived with a different understanding of etiquette. Someone familiar with the customs might know exactly how to behave. Someone visiting for the first time might not know what was expected. The performer could not assume that everyone possessed the same knowledge. This required patience. A person who made an unfamiliar mistake was not necessarily being disrespectful. Sometimes he simply did not know. The performer could quietly guide him. In doing so, she protected both the guest and the atmosphere. This was a sophisticated form of hospitality because it transformed potential embarrassment into learning. Another lesson was that correction should ideally preserve a person's dignity. If someone had done something incorrectly, there was often a way to help without making the person feel publicly incompetent. This principle extended far beyond guests. It applied to apprentices, it applied to colleagues, it applied to teachers. Even experienced people could make mistakes. The household therefore needed a culture where correction was possible without humiliation becoming the main lesson. The goal was improvement. If someone became so afraid of making mistakes that she stopped trying, the training environment had failed. The best discipline created courage rather than fear. Another unspoken rule involved learning how to recognize when someone needed encouragement and when someone needed firmer correction. Too much encouragement could allow poor habits to continue. Too much criticism could destroy confidence. The teacher had to judge the student. A beginner who was already frightened might need reassurance before correction. A confident apprentice who had become careless might need a stronger reminder. The same words would not work for everyone. Teaching therefore required understanding people. A good teacher was not simply someone who knew the craft. She knew how to teach the craft to different personalities. Another hidden lesson concerned the relationship between patience and speed. An apprentice often wanted to improve quickly, but traditional skills could not always be rushed. The body needed time to develop coordination. The ear needed time to recognize subtle differences. The mind needed time to understand etiquette. Experience needed time to accumulate. Trying to accelerate everything could actually slow progress by creating poor habits. The apprentice therefore learned to respect gradual improvement. A movement performed correctly once was not mastery. It had to become reliable. A response that worked once in conversation was not social intelligence. The performer needed to recognize similar situations repeatedly. A successful performance was encouraging. Consistent performance was professionalism. That difference mattered. Another important rule was to understand that the household's traditions had layers. Some customs were practical, others were artistic, others were social, others were symbolic. Some existed because they created order. Some existed because they carried historical meaning. Some had simply become customary over generations. The apprentice gradually learned to identify these layers. This prevented her from treating every rule as equally important. She could understand why some practices required strict adherence, while others allowed flexibility. This kind of understanding made her more intelligent within the tradition. She was no longer merely following instructions, she was interpreting them. Another hidden rule involved the use of space during conversation. Sitting too close could feel intrusive. Sitting too far away could create emotional distance. The arrangement of people influenced who spoke naturally. The performer needed to understand these invisible distances. She might adjust her position slightly without anyone noticing. A small movement could make a conversation easier. Again, the goal was not to control people. It was to create comfortable conditions. The environment could either encourage interaction or discourage it. The professional learned how to work with that environment. Another lesson: a loud voice could overpower music. A quiet voice could disappear in a large gathering. A sudden movement could interrupt a performance. Even the sound of footsteps could affect atmosphere. The performer therefore became aware of sound beyond music. She learned to move quietly when necessary. She learned to speak at an appropriate volume. She learned when silence was preferable. This was another reason the profession demanded physical awareness. The performer was constantly interacting with the environment. Another hidden rule was that an entrance should never feel like an interruption unless the situation required it. Entering a room involved timing. If a conversation was reaching an important point, waiting briefly might be appropriate. If the guest was already waiting, delaying too long would be discourteous. The performer had to judge. This seems like a tiny detail, but repeated attention to tiny details created polished behavior. The difference between awkwardness and grace was often only a few seconds. Another lesson involved departure could be as important as arrival. A performer did not simply stop participating and walk away without consideration. She needed to recognize the appropriate moment. She might complete what she was doing, acknowledge those present, then leave naturally. This created continuity. The remaining people did not feel abruptly abandoned. The performer understood that transitions mattered. Another hidden rule concerned how to respond when someone else received an unexpected opportunity. Jealousy was a natural human emotion, but professional behavior still mattered. A mature performer could acknowledge another person's success without allowing personal disappointment to become public resentment. She might feel envious privately, but she could still congratulate her colleague. Over time, she could examine her own disappointment and use it constructively. What could she improve? What opportunity might come next? Was there something she needed to learn? This turned comparison into motivation rather than hostility. Another lesson involved recognizing that opportunities were not always distributed according to talent alone. Timing, relationships, reputation, circumstances, and the needs of the household could all influence who was selected for something. Understanding this could prevent an apprentice from interpreting every missed opportunity as proof that she was inadequate. Sometimes the circumstances simply favored someone else. A mature professional focused on what she could control: her preparation. There was another lesson hidden beneath the daily routine: the ability to understand that every person entering the house brought an invisible history with them. A guest did not arrive as a blank figure. He brought his occupation, relationships, worries, habits, expectations, and previous experiences. Two people could sit in exactly the same room and experience completely different evenings. One might want lively conversation, another might prefer music. One might be fascinated by tradition, another might simply want a peaceful escape from the pressures of ordinary life. The performer could not know everything about a person immediately, so she learned to begin with observation rather than assumption. This was one of the quietest forms of intelligence inside the household. Instead of deciding what someone wanted and forcing the evening toward that expectation, the performer watched for clues. Did the guest ask questions? Did he listen closely? Did he speak often? Did he appear more interested in the musicians than the conversation? Did he repeatedly return to one particular subject? Did he become more relaxed when humor was introduced? Did he become quieter when the room became louder? Each reaction provided information. The skilled performer gradually learned to treat the evening as a conversation between many signals. Words were only one part of it. Tone, posture, pauses, attention, and timing all communicated something. The performer did not need to analyze these things consciously every second. Years of experience allowed her to recognize them almost instinctively. A beginner might hear the words, an experienced performer heard the meaning beneath them. That difference could transform an ordinary interaction into an exceptional one. Another unspoken rule was never to mistake familiarity for complete understanding. Even if a guest had visited many times, his mood could be different on any particular evening. A person who was normally energetic might arrive exhausted. Someone who usually enjoyed conversation might prefer silence. Someone who normally requested a certain performance might suddenly become interested in something else. The performer therefore avoided becoming too predictable herself. She remembered the person, but she also remained attentive to the present. This was an important distinction. Memory created continuity. Observation created relevance. Both were necessary. The same principle applied to colleagues. An apprentice who seemed confident one week might struggle the next. A senior performer, who usually handled pressure easily, might have an unusually difficult day. A teacher who appeared strict might actually be trying to protect a student's future. The household encouraged people to look beyond the surface appearances could mislead. Context mattered. Another hidden rule concerned the importance of knowing when not to interpret something personally. A guest might seem distracted, but perhaps his mind was somewhere else. A teacher might sound impatient, but perhaps she was under pressure. A colleague might answer briefly, but perhaps she was simply tired. An inexperienced person could easily turn every small interaction into a judgment about herself. The mature professional learned to pause. Is this really about me? Sometimes the answer was yes, often it was not. This ability to avoid unnecessary emotional reactions protected concentration. It also prevented small misunderstandings from becoming large conflicts. Another lesson was that professionalism required a certain amount of emotional generosity. People were imperfect. Guests could be awkward. Apprentices could forget things. Teachers could become frustrated. Colleagues could miscommunicate. If every mistake was interpreted in the harshest possible way, the household would become exhausting. Giving someone the benefit of the doubt when appropriate could make relationships stronger. This did not mean ignoring serious problems. It meant not turning every small imperfection into a personal offense. That distinction allowed people to live and work together for years. Another unspoken rule involved the importance of knowing what could safely be discussed in public and what belonged in private. A conversation that was harmless among colleagues might be inappropriate in front of guests. An internal disagreement might need to remain inside the household. A personal story might belong only to the person who experienced it. The apprentice gradually developed an internal filter. Before speaking, she learned to ask, "Who is present? What is the purpose of this conversation? Could this information embarrass someone? Could it create misunderstanding? Does it need to be said at all?" This filter became automatic. The ability to filter information was a major part of discretion. Another hidden lesson concerned the difference between being honest and being unnecessarily blunt. Honesty could be respectful. Bluntness could sometimes be careless. If a guest asked for an opinion, the performer did not need to insult something simply because she disliked it. She could express a preference without making another person's choice seem foolish. If an apprentice needed correction, the teacher could identify the problem without attacking her character. This distinction between the person and the behavior was extremely important. "You need to improve this" was different from "you are incapable." One encourages growth, the other creates shame. The best teachers understood that language could either strengthen or weaken a student. Another rule involved recognizing that silence could sometimes communicate approval, disapproval, uncertainty, or simply concentration. The apprentice learned not to assume one meaning immediately. A senior teacher might remain silent because the student was doing well, or because she was waiting to see what the student would do next, or because she was deciding how to explain the correction. The apprentice needed to observe what happened afterward. This encouraged patience. Not every signal demanded an immediate response. Another hidden rule concerned how to handle moments when the performer herself did not know what to say. Beginners often fear silence because they believe every second must be filled, but a professional could pause. Think, then answer. A thoughtful pause was often better than a rushed response. This was especially useful when guests asked unusual questions. The performer did not need to invent an answer simply to avoid silence. She could say that she was not certain. She could offer what she knew. She could suggest another person who might know more. Honesty combined with composure was more credible than false confidence. Another lesson involved understanding that a good conversation could contain disagreement without becoming unpleasant. Different opinions did not automatically mean conflict. The performer could ask questions. "Why do you feel that way? What made you interested in that? Have you always thought so?" Such questions turned disagreement into curiosity. This kept the conversation alive without forcing everyone to agree. The ability to remain comfortable around differences was another sign of social maturity. Another unspoken rule concerned not allowing a particularly charismatic person to dominate the entire room. A strong personality could easily take over a gathering. The performer could gently create space for others. She might ask another guest a question. She might invite a musician to comment. She might introduce a related topic. This required subtlety because openly telling someone to stop talking could embarrass him. The best intervention felt natural. The conversation simply changed direction. Nobody needed to know that it had been deliberately balanced. That was the invisible work of the host. Another lesson was that the performer needed to understand when a person genuinely wanted to be challenged and when he simply wanted to relax. Some guests enjoyed intellectual discussion. Others did not want their evening to feel like a debate. The performer could adapt. This did not mean becoming intellectually dishonest. It meant recognizing the purpose of the gathering. A guest who had spent all day dealing with serious responsibilities might value an evening where he could simply listen to music and laugh. Another might specifically seek conversation about art or history. Hospitality meant understanding the difference. Another hidden rule involved the importance of not making every interaction about the performer herself. Even if she had interesting stories, the guest's experiences were often the better starting point. Ask about his interests. Listen to his answer, follow the topic. Then contribute. This created reciprocity. Conversation became something shared rather than something performed. The performer was not simply displaying personality. She was creating connection, Anna the lesson concerned. The power of remembering a small detail from a previous meeting. A guest might mention a particular place, book, seasonal event, or personal interest. Weeks later, the performer could ask about it. That tiny memory could have an enormous effect. It communicated, "I listened." This was one of the most powerful forms of hospitality because it made people feel seen. But again, the memory needed to be used naturally. If it was displayed too aggressively, it could feel artificial. The best memory was quiet. Another hidden rule was to understand that a performer's relationship with guests existed within boundaries of professionalism. Warmth did not mean unrestricted intimacy. A guest could feel comfortable without being given access to everything. The performer could share some personality while keeping other parts private. There was another layer to life inside the household that became apparent only after an apprentice had spent enough time there to understand that etiquette was not simply about what happened during an evening. It began long before the first guest arrived. Preparation itself had a rhythm, and that rhythm taught another quiet lesson: never wait until the last possible moment to become ready. A person who prepared early had room to respond when something unexpected happened. A person who waited until the final minute had no such freedom. If something was missing, there was no time to find it. If a garment needed attention, there was no time to correct it. If an instrument required preparation, the entire schedule could become strained. Readiness therefore created calm. The apprentice gradually discovered that experienced women often appeared unhurried precisely because they had already anticipated what might go wrong. They knew which tasks took longer than expected. They knew which objects were easily misplaced. They knew which parts of a performance required extra attention. They understood that the smoothest evening was usually the result of preparation that had happened hours earlier. This created an interesting illusion. The guest might see a calm performer and assume that she was naturally relaxed in reality. Her calmness could be the product of discipline. She had removed uncertainty before uncertainty had the chance to appear. That was another hidden rule. Preparation was not simply about getting things ready. It was about protecting composure. An apprentice who understood this began to think differently about time. Instead of asking, "How quickly can I finish this?" she began asking, "What could become a problem later if I do this carelessly now?" That question changed her behavior. She checked things twice. She remembered details. She prepared alternatives. She allowed time for unexpected delays. She began to understand that professionalism was partly the ability to make tomorrow easier by doing today's work properly. Another unspoken rule concerned the careful treatment of garments. A traditional kimono was not merely something to put on before meeting guests. Its arrangement, condition, and handling were part of the visual language of the evening. Fabric could communicate season, occasion, formality, and aesthetic preference. Patterns could be selected thoughtfully, colors could work with the surroundings, accessories could complete the impression. For the apprentice, learning how to handle clothing properly was therefore an education in attention. She had to learn not to rush. She had to understand how garments were folded and stored. She had to recognize that delicate materials could be damaged by careless handling. She had to understand that clothing preparation could take time. The garment was part of the performance before the performance even began. Yet the lesson was not simply look beautiful. It was more subtle. The clothing had to belong to the moment. Something too casual could feel inappropriate. Something too elaborate could overwhelm the setting. Something associated with another season could feel out of place. The best choice was not necessarily the most impressive one. It was the most appropriate. This idea of appropriateness appeared everywhere inside the household. The right movement, the right volume, the right amount of conversation, the right level of humor, the right distance, the right timing, the right amount of decoration. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything had to fit. Another hidden rule concerned the importance of seasonal awareness. In traditional Japanese aesthetics, the changing seasons could influence clothing, food, decorations, music, and conversation. An apprentice therefore learned to notice details that a visitor might overlook. A particular flower could immediately suggest a season. A certain pattern could evoke a particular time of year. A change in weather could alter the atmosphere of an evening. The performer could acknowledge these changes subtly. She did not need to announce, "It is now a different season." The room itself could communicate it. This was another example of indirect communication. The environment spoke. The performer simply understood how to listen. Another lesson involved recognizing that the guest might not consciously understand why an arrangement felt appropriate. He might simply feel that the room looked beautiful. That was enough. The professional did not need recognition for every detail. In fact, drawing attention to every carefully chosen element could reduce its effect. Some things were meant to be noticed emotionally rather than explained intellectually. This was another reason restraint mattered. The performer learned that explaining too much could sometimes destroy mystery. Another unspoken rule involved knowing when to introduce information and when to allow discovery. If a guest noticed a seasonal decoration and asked about it, if he did not ask, there might be no need to turn it into a lecture. Curiosity should come naturally. This principle applied to music as well. A piece could be introduced briefly. Perhaps its mood or seasonal connection could be mentioned. Then the music could speak for itself. The performer trusted the audience enough to let them experience rather than constantly interpret. Another lesson concerned the use of repetition in conversation. If a guest returned often, the performer might remember previous topics, but she needed to avoid sounding as though she were following a script. People change. Their interests change. Their circumstances change. A previous conversation could become a starting point rather than a fixed pattern. This required genuine listening. If the guest mentioned that something important had happened since the last visit, the performer could follow that new information. Continuity did not mean repetition. It meant relationship. Another hidden rule was that remembering someone's name could be powerful, but remembering something meaningful about them could be even more powerful. A name establishes recognition. A remembered interest establishes attention. The difference can be small, but emotionally significant. It tells the person that he was actually heard. This kind of memory was part of social skill. It was also one reason experienced performers could create an atmosphere that felt surprisingly personal, even within a formal setting. Another lesson concerned how to respond when a guest became overly enthusiastic. Enthusiasm could be positive, but too much excitement could sometimes disrupt the atmosphere. The performer did not need to suppress the person's happiness. She simply guided it. If someone became extremely animated, she could respond warmly without becoming equally chaotic. Her calmness provided balance. This was another example of emotional regulation. The performer did not simply mirror every emotion in the room. She helped stabilize the room. If the guest was nervous, she could become warmer. If he was overly energetic, she could become calmer. If he was quiet, she could give him space. The goal was harmony rather than imitation. Another hidden rule involved knowing when to allow humor to become playful and when to stop it. Humor could bring people together, but jokes could easily cross boundaries. The performer needed to know her audience. What one person found amusing might embarrass another. A joke about a harmless subject could create laughter. A joke about a person's weakness could create discomfort. The professional therefore learned to use humor carefully. The strongest humor did not require someone else to become the target. It created shared amusement rather than humiliation. Another lesson involved learning to laugh naturally, without making the entire evening revolve around entertainment. Laughter it did not need to happen constantly. A quiet moment after laughter could actually make the laughter feel more meaningful. Again, rhythm mattered. Conversation had peaks and valleys. Music could create transitions. Silence could restore attention. The performer learned to let the evening breathe. Another unspoken rule concerned the treatment of food and drink. These were not simply things placed on a table. Their presentation contributed to the experience. Seasonality, arrangement, timing, and manner of serving could all matter. The performer did not necessarily control every aspect of food preparation, but she understood how food fit into the larger atmosphere. A dish could become a conversation topic. A seasonal ingredient could connect the evening to the time of year. The appearance of something could create anticipation. Again, the object was not isolated. It was part of the story of the evening. Another lesson involved not interrupting someone while they were eating, simply because the performer wanted to continue a conversation. The guest's comfort mattered. Sometimes conversation could pause. Sometimes the performer could wait. This was another small example of attention. A person who is eating does not always need to be entertained. The professional learned to recognize natural pauses. Another hidden rule concerned the handling of empty moments. Beginners often fear them. Experienced performers understood that an empty moment could be useful. Someone could finish a drink. A musician could prepare. A guest could look around. A brief silence could reset attention. Not every pause was a failure. Some pauses made the next moment stronger. This was perhaps one of the hardest lessons for a young performer, because modern life often encourages constant stimulation. Traditional hospitality could teach the opposite. Sometimes doing less made the experience richer. Another part of the hidden education was learning that the house had its own memory. Certain rooms could carry stories that were never written down. A particular corner might be associated with an old teacher. A particular instrument might have been played during important gatherings. A certain garment might have belonged to someone who had become respected many years earlier. Younger members gradually learned these associations through casual conversations and repeated observation. The history of the household was therefore not preserved only in books or official records. It lived in objects, routines, stories, and the memories of the people who remained. This gave ordinary objects a different significance. A fan was not simply a fan. A musical instrument was not merely a tool. A garment was not simply something worn for appearance. Each could become part of a chain connecting one generation to another. When an apprentice was trusted with something that had belonged to a senior performer, she understood that careful handling was more than practical responsibility. She was temporarily carrying a piece of someone else's history. That feeling could create humility. The apprentice was not the beginning. She had entered a story that was already centuries old, and if she became successful, she would eventually become part of the story herself. Another unspoken rule was that stories about the past had to be treated with care. Older members might remember. One person could recall a teacher as extremely strict, while another remembered her as surprisingly kind. One might remember a performance as a triumph, while another remembered everything that went wrong behind the scenes. Memory is not a perfect recording. It changes with time. The apprentice gradually learned to listen without assuming that every story was absolute historical fact. Stories could contain lessons even when details had become uncertain. What mattered was often the principle. A story about a famous mistake could teach preparation. A story about a respected teacher could teach patience. A story about an embarrassing evening could teach discretion. A story about an apprentice who eventually became accomplished could teach perseverance. The household's history was therefore also a collection of warnings and encouragement. Another hidden rule concerned how much of that history should be shared with outsiders. Some stories were harmless, others belonged within the community. Knowing the difference was part of discretion. A performer who repeated every private story simply because it was interesting could damage trust. The apprentice learned that possessing information did not automatically give her permission to share it. This was a powerful lesson because knowledge itself could create temptation. A person might feel important because she knew something others did not, but true discretion meant being comfortable knowing something without displaying that knowledge. Silence could demonstrate maturity. Another lesson involved learning how to recognize the difference between a secret and a private matter. Not everything private needed to be treated as mysterious. People were entitled to personal space, without every detail becoming a hidden secret. This distinction helped create healthier relationships. The apprentice learned not to investigate unnecessarily. If someone wanted to share something, she listened. If someone did not, she respected the boundary. Curiosity was valuable for learning. Intrusion was not. Another hidden rule concerned the way younger members were expected to watch how senior women handled difficult guests. This was one of the most practical forms of education. An apprentice could learn more from watching a difficult conversation than from hearing a lecture about difficult conversations. She observed the senior woman's posture, her voice, her pauses, her ability to remain calm. She watched how the woman refused something without creating unnecessary hostility. She watched how she redirected a conversation. She watched how she involved another person when necessary. The apprentice was learning conflict management without realizing that she was learning it. Later, when faced with a similar situation, she might remember the exact rhythm of that earlier response. This was how professional instincts were transferred. Another unspoken rule involved not showing panic when an unexpected person entered the room, or when plans changed suddenly. The guest should not feel the household becoming confused simply because something had gone differently from the original plan. Behind the scenes, people might have to adjust quickly, but the adjustment itself could remain quiet. Someone could move an object. Another person could change the order of events. A senior performer could alter the conversation. A musician could adapt. The audience experienced continuity. This was another reason teamwork mattered. A single person could not always manage every change alone. Another lesson was that a well-functioning household required people to understand one another's roles. If everyone tried to do everything, knowing who was responsible for what reduced unnecessary interference. An apprentice learned where her responsibilities began and ended. She also learned when another person had greater authority. This prevented her from accidentally creating problems while trying to be helpful. Helping was valuable. Helping without understanding the system could sometimes create more work. Therefore, before acting, the apprentice learned to observe. Was this my responsibility, should I ask? Who normally handles this? That small pause could prevent mistakes. Another hidden rule involved respecting the time of teachers. Senior performers had responsibilities of their own. An apprentice could not assume that every question needed an immediate answer. She learned to choose the right moment. If the teacher was preparing for an event, perhaps the question could wait. If the teacher was resting, perhaps it could be discussed later. If the matter was urgent, the apprentice needed to communicate that clearly. This taught consideration. People's time was part of their dignity. Another lesson concerned the importance of not confusing access with entitlement. Living in the same household did not mean that an apprentice automatically had access to everything. There were private spaces, private conversations, personal belongings, professional matters. The apprentice learned boundaries through experience. She did not need to be constantly reminded. Eventually, she understood that respect often means recognizing what is not yours to enter. Another hidden rule involved the careful management of invitations and social obligations. A gathering was not created simply by deciding that people should meet. Timing, relationships, availability, and appropriateness mattered. The wrong combination of people could create tension. The right combination could create remarkable conversation. Experienced people therefore developed an understanding of social chemistry. Who knows whom, who gets along, who might appreciate the same kind of entertainment, who should be introduced carefully. These decisions could shape the atmosphere before the evening even began. Another lesson concerned the importance of introductions. Introducing two people was more than saying their names. The performer could provide a small piece of context. This person is interested in, this person is known for, this is someone who has studied. Such information gave the two people an immediate starting point. A good introduction reduced awkwardness. A poor introduction could leave two strangers staring at each other without knowing how to begin. This was another small skill that could become highly refined. Another hidden rule was that a performer should avoid embarrassing someone by revealing too much information during an introduction. The goal was to create connection, not expose private details. Again, discretion operated beneath ordinary etiquette. The performer needed to know what information was useful and what information was unnecessary. This was another reason experience mattered. A beginner might say too much. An experienced person knew how little was actually required. Another lesson involved understanding that people could become uncomfortable if they felt watched too closely. Observation had to remain subtle. The performer was attentive, but she did not stare. She listened, but she did not interrogate. She noticed, but she did not announce every observation. This created a feeling of ease. The guest could relax because the attention felt natural. That was another paradox of hospitality. The performer had to pay close attention without making the other person feel examined. Another hidden rule concerned how to handle a guest who spoke very little. The natural mistake was to assume that the person was bored, but silence could have many meanings. Perhaps he was shy, perhaps he was tired, perhaps he was deeply interested in observing, perhaps he preferred music to conversation. The performer could offer opportunities without forcing participation. A question, a comment, a performance, then space. If the guest wanted to speak, he could. This respect for silence could make a quiet person feel much more comfortable. Another lesson involved the opposite problem. A guest who spoke continuously. The performer needed to listen without allowing one person to overwhelm everyone else. She could redirect gently. She could invite another person to contribute. She could introduce a new subject. She could use music as a natural transition. The goal was balance rather than confrontation.